from the mystery of two young princes who vanished in the tower to the long twilight reign of Queen Elizabeth II, this is a gentle but gripping journey that we're about to embark on, lasting over 3 relaxing hours. We'll begin with why a medieval king's nephews were never seen again, and move deeper into how a quiet princess became the world's most seen sovereign. So put your phone or television remote to the side, dim the lights, and please make sure to like the video, subscribe, and let me know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, let's begin. William I, the Norman Conquest. Picture, if you will, the morning mist rising from the Channel waters in late September 1066. Duke William of Normandy stands on the deck of his flagship, the Mora, watching the white cliffs of England emerge from the grey dawn. Behind him, nearly 700 vessels bob and creak in the gentle swell, carrying perhaps 14,000 men who will reshape a kingdom forever. The story begins not with conquest, but with a promise made 14 years earlier. Edward the Confessor, that pious king who spent more time in prayer than in governance, had supposedly pledged his throne to his Norman cousin. Harold Godwinson, England's most powerful earl, had sworn an oath on sacred relics to support William's claim. Yet when Edward died childless in January 1066, it was Harold who took the crown in Westminster Abbey, breaking what William considered a sacred vow. The invasion fleet that landed at Pevensey Bay was no ragtag collection of adventurers. William had spent months assembling knights from across northern France, Normans, Bretons, Flemings, men from Anjou and Maine. Each had been promised English lands in return for 40 days' service. The papal banner flew above William's tent, for the Pope himself had blessed this enterprise as righteous war against an oath-breaker and usurper. But Harold was no easy target. He had just marched his army 300 miles north to crush a Norwegian invasion at Stamford Bridge, where Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king, fell with an arrow through his throat. Now Harold force-marched south again, gathering what men he could, determined to meet the Norman threat before it could spread inland. The two armies met on Senlac Hill, just outside Hastings, on October 14th. Harold's housecarls formed a shield wall across the ridge, their great two-handed axes glinting in the autumn sun. William's cavalry charged uphill again and again, only to break against that wall of lime wood and iron. The battle swayed back and forth through the long day, until evening shadows began to lengthen, and Harold fell, struck down near his dragon banner, though whether by arrow or sword, no chronicler could say for certain. With Harold dead and his brothers beside him, resistance crumbled like morning frost. William marched in a great arc around London, accepting submissions, burning villages that resisted, until the remaining English nobles came to him at Berkhamsted and offered him the crown. On Christmas Day 1066, in Westminster Abbey, where Harold had been crowned 11 months before, William became King of England. Though the ceremony was interrupted when Norman soldiers outside mistook the English crowd's acclamation for revolt and began setting fire to nearby houses. The transformation that followed was breathtaking in its scope. Norman French became the language of court and law, while English retreated to the fields and hearths of common folk. Ancient English earldoms were carved up and redistributed to Norman lords, who held their lands directly from the king in return for military service. Where Saxon thegns had ruled by custom and consent, Norman barons now commanded from atop massive stone keeps that sprouted across the landscape like grey mushrooms after rain. Castle building became an obsession. The White Tower at London, rising 90 feet above the Thames, proclaimed royal power to anyone who dared approach the city. At Warwick, at Nottingham, at York, at Chester, everywhere the Normans planted their authority, stone towers followed. These weren't merely fortresses, but administrative centres, symbols of a new order where power flowed downward from the king through a carefully structured hierarchy of obligation and reward. The old 100 courts and shire moots continued to function, but now under Norman sheriffs who answered to Winchester rather than to local custom. English law began its slow fusion with Norman practice, creating something new, a common law that would eventually spread far beyond England's shores. 20 years after Hastings, William ordered his great survey, the Domesday Book. Royal commissioners travelled to every village, recording who held what land, how many ploughs each manor possessed, how many mills, how much woodland, down to the last pig and beeswax hive. It was an act of administrative genius that revealed the kingdom's wealth with unprecedented precision, though to the English peasants questioned by these foreign clerks, it must have felt like the Last Judgment itself. By William's death in 1087, England had been thoroughly remade. The old Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Alfred and Edward was gone forever, replaced by something more tightly governed, more efficiently taxed, more integrated into the broader world of European politics and culture. William himself died not in England but in Rouen, campaigning against the French king, his body so swollen that it burst during his funeral, a sadly undignified end for the man who had changed the course of English history with a single decisive battle on a Sussex hilltop. The Norman conquest wasn't just a change of rulers, it was the creation of a new England, one that looked as much across the Channel as across the North Sea, one where stone replaced wood, where Latin displaced the vernacular in official documents, where the future would be built not on Saxon custom but on Norman ambition and continental innovation. William II, a restless reign. William Rufus, so called for his ruddy complexion and perhaps his temperament, inherited a kingdom but not peace. His father's deathbed division of the Anglo-Norman realm had been meant to prevent civil war, but instead it nearly guaranteed one. Elder brother Robert got Normandy, while England went to William, the more capable son despite being younger. This arrangement satisfied neither brother nor their Norman barons, who found themselves awkwardly holding lands on both sides of the Channel under two different masters. The new King's Court at Westminster was a place of constant tension. Barons like Odo of Bayeux and Robert de Mowbray whispered of rebellion, suggesting that Robert Curthose would make a more pliable ruler. But they had misjudged William Rufus entirely. When revolt came in 1088, barely a year after his coronation, the king proved himself his father's son in ruthless efficiency. He bought the loyalty of English peasants with promises of good laws and light taxes, then used their support to crush the Norman rebels systematically. Odo ended his days in exile, while other conspirators found their lands confiscated and redistributed to men whose loyalty was unquestioned. The king's relationship with the church proved far more complex and ultimately more damaging to his reputation. When Lanfranc, the learned Archbishop of Canterbury who had guided William I's religious policies, died in 1089, Rufus saw opportunity where others saw crisis. He simply left the position vacant, collecting the revenues of Canterbury for his own use, while claiming he was taking time to find the right man. 4 years passed in this profitable arrangement, until a near-fatal illness in 1093 convinced the king that divine displeasure might be real after all. Anselm of Bec, the philosopher-monk Rufus, eventually appointed to Canterbury, was possibly the worst choice the king could have made if he wanted a compliant archbishop. Anselm believed passionately in the independence of the church from royal control, while Rufus saw bishops as wealthy officials who should serve royal interests first and God second. Their quarrels over church revenues, the appointment of bishops, and papal authority created a running crisis that poisoned the remainder of the reign. Meanwhile, the king's personal household became notorious for its extravagance and unconventional customs. Rufus never married, showing little interest in women, and surrounded himself with young courtiers whose long hair and elaborate dress scandalized chroniclers. Whether their shock reflected genuine moral concerns or simple Norman prejudice against anything that seemed too refined is difficult to judge at this distance, but the stories they told painted a picture of a court more concerned with fashion and fine living than with traditional masculine virtues of war and hunting. Yet Rufus was undeniably an effective king in practical matters. His financial administration squeezed every possible penny from royal rights and feudal obligations. When bishoprics fell vacant, their revenues flowed to Westminster. When barons died without clear heirs, the king sold wardships and marriages to the highest bidders. This systematic exploitation of feudal law filled the royal treasury, but created lasting resentment among the nobility, who found themselves treated more like revenue sources than honored counselors. The king's military campaigns showed the same mixture of success and controversial methods. He invaded Scotland twice, forcing King Malcolm III to submit and pay homage. In Wales, he established new Norman lordships that would endure for centuries. Most ambitiously, he repeatedly crossed to Normandy, sometimes supporting his brother against French pressure, sometimes fighting Robert directly for control of key fortresses. These campaigns were expensive but generally successful, demonstrating that England could now project power across the Channel as effectively as any continental kingdom. The forest laws that Rufus expanded became a source of particular bitterness. His father had already declared vast areas of England to be royal forest, subject to special laws that protected the king's hunting rights, even on privately owned land. Rufus extended these boundaries further, creating what amounted to a parallel legal system where forest courts could impose crushing fines for killing deer, cutting timber, or even allowing pigs to forage for acorns without royal permission. It was in the New Forest, his father's most controversial creation, that William Rufus met his end on August 1100. The official story, recorded by chroniclers who weren't present, tells of a hunting accident. Walter Tyrrell, a Norman nobleman, supposedly shot an arrow at a stag that glanced off a tree and struck the king in the chest, but the circumstances were suspicious enough to fuel centuries of speculation about murder. The king's body was found hours later by charcoal burners, abandoned by his hunting companions, and carried to Winchester Cathedral in a peasant's cart that leaked blood along the road. What made the death particularly suspicious was the speed with which Henry, the king's youngest brother, secured the royal treasury at Winchester and rode to Westminster for his coronation. If this was truly an accident, Henry's preparations seem remarkably thorough. More likely, perhaps, is that William Rufus's harsh financial policies and bitter quarrels with the church had created enough enemies that his death in a remote forest clearing was seen as a happy convenience rather than a tragedy to be investigated. The reign ended as it had begun, with uncertainty and whispered conspiracy. But for all his faults, William Rufus had maintained the strength of royal government his father had established, proving that Norman rule in England would survive the conqueror's death. His methods were often harsh and his personality frequently unpleasant, but he left his successor a kingdom that was wealthy, well-defended, and firmly under royal control. Henry I, keeping the kingdom tidy. Henry, the youngest son of the conqueror, possessed what his elder brothers notably lacked, a talent for patient, methodical governance. Where Robert Curthose was charming but ineffective, and William Rufus was capable but abrasive, Henry combined administrative skill with just enough political cunning to turn his unexpected inheritance into a remarkably successful reign. His rapid seizure of the crown following his brother's death in the New Forest showed planning and decisiveness that would characterize the next 35 years. The new king's first challenge was legitimacy. Robert Curthose, returning from the First Crusade, crowned with glory and laden with relics, had a stronger claim by primogeniture and the backing of many Norman barons who held lands in both England and Normandy. Henry's response was characteristically shrewd. He courted English support by marrying Edith, daughter of Malcolm III of Scotland and great-granddaughter of Edmund Ironside, the last native English king before the conquest. This alliance with the old English royal house outraged Norman nobles, who mockingly called the royal couple Godric and Godjifu after common English peasant names, but it gave Henry's rule a legitimacy that went deeper than mere conquest. The Charter of Liberties that Henry issued at his coronation proved even more significant in the long term. This document, promising to end his brother's harsh financial practices and respect traditional rights, became a model for later constitutional developments. Henry pledged to stop selling church offices, to limit the exploitation of feudal incidents, and to restore the good laws of Edward the Confessor. While he didn't always honor these promises in practice, the very act of putting royal promises in writing established a precedent that would echo through Magna Carta to the constitutional settlements of later centuries. Henry's administrative innovations transformed English government from a personal household system into something approaching a modern bureaucracy. The Exchequer, meeting twice yearly at Winchester and Westminster, developed sophisticated accounting methods using a checkered cloth that gave the institution its name. Royal justices began to travel regular circuits, bringing consistent legal procedures to every corner of the kingdom. The royal chancery, producing an unprecedented volume of writs and charters, created a paper trail of government that historians still marvel at today. The king's approach to personnel management was equally systematic. Unlike his predecessors, who relied heavily on great nobles and church leaders, Henry promoted talented men of modest birth who owed their positions entirely to royal favour. Roger of Salisbury, born a simple parish priest, became the most powerful man in England after the king himself, developing the administrative systems that would outlast the Norman dynasty. These new men had no independent power base and thus remained loyal to the crown that had elevated them. Henry's military campaigns showed the same methodical planning that characterized his domestic policies. The conquest of Normandy from his brother Robert took 6 years of careful preparation, diplomatic isolation of his enemy, and systematic reduction of key fortresses. The decisive battle at Tinchebray in 1106 was less a glorious charge than a well-executed tactical plan that left Robert a prisoner for the remaining 28 years of his life. Henry had reunited his father's dominions, but through patient strategy rather than dramatic gestures. The king's personal life reflected his practical approach to royal responsibilities. Though devoted to his wife Edith, whom he rechristened Matilda for Norman ears, Henry acknowledged at least 20 illegitimate children by various mistresses. This wasn't mere royal self-indulgence but calculated dynasty building. These children became valuable diplomatic assets, married into noble families across Britain and northern France to cement political alliances. His illegitimate son Robert became Earl of Gloucester and one of the most trusted advisors in the kingdom. The prosperity that England enjoyed under Henry's rule became legendary among later generations. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, usually sparing with praise for Norman kings, admitted that merchants could travel safely with bags of gold and that no man dared harm another in the king's peace. This security wasn't accidental but the result of systematic legal reforms that extended royal justice into areas previously governed by local custom. Henry's sheriffs were chosen for competence rather than birth, and held accountable through regular audits at the Exchequer. The king's relationship with the church, carefully managed after his brother's mistakes, achieved a workable compromise between royal authority and ecclesiastical independence. The Concordat of London in 1107 resolved the investiture controversy that had poisoned relations between crown and church. Bishops would do homage to the king for their temporal lands while receiving their spiritual authority from the Pope. This pragmatic solution became a model for similar agreements across Europe. But Henry's greatest triumph contained the seeds of future disaster. His only legitimate son, William Atheling, was everything a medieval king could want in an heir: brave, intelligent, pious, and beloved by the nobility. The prince's death in the White Ship disaster of 1120 shattered not just a father's heart but the kingdom's stability. The ship, crossing from Normandy to England on a calm November evening, struck a rock and sank within sight of Barfleur harbour. Only one man survived to tell the tale of how England's future king drowned within swimming distance of shore. Henry's response to this catastrophe showed both his political acumen and his human limitations. He remarried within months, hoping desperately for another son, but his new wife bore only disappointment. The king then took the unprecedented step of naming his daughter Matilda as his heir, extracting oaths of loyalty from his barons, despite their obvious reluctance to accept female rule. When Matilda married Geoffrey of Anjou, the future Henry II's father, it seemed that succession was secured through the legitimate line. Yet Henry's death at Lyon-la-Forêt in December 1135, allegedly from eating a surfeit of lampreys, despite his physician's warnings, left behind a kingdom whose future was far from certain. The oaths sworn to Matilda proved worthless when Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, seized the crown with the support of barons who preferred a king they could potentially control over a queen married to their traditional Angevin enemies. Henry I's legacy was the transformation of Norman England from a conquered territory into an efficiently governed kingdom that could compete with any power in Europe. His administrative systems survived the civil war that followed his death and provided the foundation for the even greater achievements of his grandson Henry II. He had shown that royal government could be both strong and systematic. that efficiency could coexist with justice, and that a kingdom could prosper under a ruler who understood that power was most secure when it served the broader interests of the realm. Stephen, Matilda, the anarchy. The news of Henry I's death in December 1135 sent shockwaves through a kingdom that had known 35 years of ordered government. Within 3 weeks, Stephen of Blois had crossed from Boulogne, seized the royal treasury at Winchester, and persuaded the Archbishop of Canterbury to crown him king. It was a breathtakingly audacious coup, breaking solemn oaths sworn to support Matilda's claim in favor of the immediate practical advantages of male rule and Stephen's personal charm. Stephen's initial months on the throne seemed to justify the Baron's choice. The new king was everything Henry I had not been. Generous where his uncle was grasping, trusting where Henry was suspicious, quick to forgive where Henry held grudges for decades. The royal court became a place of open-handed hospitality instead of careful accounting. Stephen distributed titles and lands with a liberality that delighted recipients but alarmed the few administrators who understood the kingdom's finances. But this generosity masked fundamental weaknesses in Stephen's position. His claim rested entirely on the Baron's acceptance of his usurpation, and that acceptance could be withdrawn as easily as it had been granted. When David I of Scotland invaded northern England in 1138, ostensibly supporting his niece Matilda's claim but actually pursuing his own territorial ambitions, Stephen's response revealed the fragility of his authority. The Battle of the Standard near Northallerton was technically an English victory, but Stephen was forced to cede Cumberland and Westmoreland to the Scots to secure peace. The arrival of Matilda and her half-brother Robert of Gloucester in England in September 1139 transformed scattered discontent into organized rebellion. Matilda, now 37 and hardened by years of conflict in Normandy, was a far more formidable opponent than Stephen had anticipated. Her marriage to Geoffrey of Anjou brought not only legitimacy but also military expertise and financial resources from one of France's most dynamic principalities. The civil war that followed was unlike anything England had experienced since the Norman conquest. It wasn't a series of decisive battles but a grinding struggle of siege warfare, shifting allegiances, and devastated landscapes. Contemporary chroniclers, writing with the freedom that comes from witnessing unprecedented horror, described a kingdom where men said openly that Christ and his saints slept. The Empress, as Matilda styled herself from her first marriage to the Holy Roman Emperor, established her power base in the west, controlling Bristol, Gloucester, and much of the Welsh March through her brother Robert's influence. Stephen's strength lay in the southeast, particularly in London and Kent, where his wife Matilda of Boulogne proved a capable administrator and military commander in her own right. Between these two power centres, the country fragmented into a patchwork of local lordships where individual barons pursued their own interests, with minimal reference to either claimant. The Siege of Lincoln in February 1141 marked both the high point of Matilda's fortunes and the beginning of her ultimate failure. Stephen, attempting to relieve the castle, was captured when his forces were routed by Robert of Gloucester's disciplined charge. For a few months, it seemed that the Empress had won. She entered London in triumph, accepted the submission of several major barons, and began planning her coronation at Westminster Abbey. But Matilda's political skills proved unequal to her military success. Where Stephen had been generous to a fault, the Empress was imperious and demanding. She alienated the citizens of London by insisting on immediate payment of heavy taxes, rejected compromises that might have won over wavering barons, and showed little appreciation for the careful balance between firmness and flexibility that English governance required. When Stephen's queen organized the relief of Winchester, where Matilda was besieged, the Empress was forced to flee, losing her most important prisoner when Robert of Gloucester was captured in exchange for Stephen's release. The return of Stephen to active leadership did little to restore royal authority. The kingdom had fragmented beyond easy repair, with local strongmen ruling from improvised castles built without royal permission. The author of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, writing in despair, recorded that every rich man built his castle and defended it against the king, and they filled the land full of castles. These unauthorized fortifications, known as adulterine castles, became centers of localized tyranny where individual barons extracted tribute from surrounding villages. The human cost of this prolonged conflict was devastating. Monastic chroniclers, usually focused on spiritual rather than temporal concerns, documented widespread famine, the collapse of trade, and the breakdown of legal systems that had maintained peace for generations. The Peterborough Chronicle's famous lament that men said openly that Christ and his saints slept captured not just physical suffering, but a profound sense that the divinely ordained order of society had collapsed. Yet even in this chaos, certain institutions proved remarkably resilient. The Exchequer continued to function, albeit with reduced efficiency, in territories controlled by each claimant. Sheriffs appointed by Stephen in some shires worked alongside those appointed by Matilda in others, creating a bureaucratic chaos that somehow maintained minimal governmental functions. The Church, despite being pulled in different directions by competing loyalties, provided continuity through its established administrative structures and its role as mediator between the warring parties. The gradual emergence of Henry of Anjou, Matilda's son, as a credible alternative to both claimants marked the beginning of the end for this long conflict. Young Henry combined his mother's legitimate claim with his father's military resources and his own considerable personal abilities. His first expedition to England in 1147 at age 14 was a disaster, but his return in 1153 as a 20-year-old duke commanding substantial forces from Normandy and Anjou presented Stephen with an opponent he could not defeat. The Treaty of Winchester, negotiated in November 1153, represented exhaustion rather than victory for either side. Stephen would remain king for his lifetime, but Henry would succeed him as the rightful heir. This solution satisfied neither the legitimist supporters of Matilda nor the adherents of Stephen's family, but it offered something more valuable than ideological purity: an end to civil war. Stephen's death at Dover in October 1154, worn out at age 60 by 2 decades of constant warfare, closed one of the darkest chapters in English medieval history. The anarchy, as later historians would call it, had demonstrated both the fragility of royal authority when it lacked broad consent and the remarkable ability of English institutions to survive even the most severe political crises. The new king, Henry II, inherited a kingdom scarred by civil war but not fundamentally broken. The administrative systems created by Henry I had survived, albeit in weakened form. The legal traditions that would evolve into English common law had been preserved in scattered shire courts and ecclesiastical tribunals. Most importantly, the experience of anarchy had created a broad consensus among nobles, clergy, and common people that strong royal government, for all its potential abuses, was preferable to the localized tyranny that emerged when central authority collapsed. Henry II, Empire, Becket. The young man who inherited the English throne in 1154 commanded territories that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, an empire larger than any since Charlemagne. Henry Plantagenet, the first of his dynasty to rule England, brought together the inheritance of his mother Matilda with the acquisitions of his father Geoffrey of Anjou and his own marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine. At 21, he was master of England, Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and the vast Duchy of Aquitaine, roughly half of what would later become France. This Angevin Empire, as historians would name it, was less a unified state than a collection of territories held together by the restless energy of one remarkable man. Henry spoke no English and spent perhaps a third of his 35-year reign actually in England, yet he understood the kingdom's needs better than many native-born rulers. His first task was to repair the damage of Stephen's reign, dismantling the adulterine castles that had sprouted during the anarchy, and restoring the administrative systems his grandfather Henry I had created. The destruction of unauthorized fortifications proceeded with systematic thoroughness that demonstrated the new king's grasp of power. Over 1,000 castles built without royal permission were demolished, their stones often recycled into royal projects. Barons who had grown accustomed to ruling their localities like independent princes found themselves summoned to court, their private armies disbanded, their judicial powers transferred to royal officials. Within 5 years, England was more tightly controlled than it had been even under the Conqueror. Henry's innovations in legal administration would prove his most lasting legacy. The system of royal courts that emerged during his reign wasn't imposed from above, but grew organically from practical solutions to immediate problems. When local courts proved corrupt or incompetent, royal justices offered alternatives. When baronial courts delivered arbitrary judgments, the king's writ provided appeal. The common law that developed wasn't common because it was imposed uniformly, but because it was commonly preferred to the alternatives available. The great legal reforms began with the Constitutions of Clarendon in 1164, which attempted to define the relationship between royal and ecclesiastical courts. Henry insisted that clerks convicted of serious crimes in church courts should be handed over to royal courts for punishment, arguing that spiritual penalties were insufficient for temporal crimes. This seemingly technical dispute over jurisdiction masked a fundamental conflict about the nature of royal authority in a Christian kingdom. Thomas Becket, whom Henry had elevated from his chancellorship to the Archbishopric of Canterbury, surprised everyone by opposing these reforms with passionate intensity. The man who had been the king's closest friend and most trusted administrator transformed overnight into his most implacable enemy. Historians still debate whether this transformation reflected genuine religious conversion, political calculation, or simple personality change, but its effects were immediate and dramatic. The conflict between king and archbishop escalated through a series of confrontations that revealed both men's strengths and weaknesses. Henry's attempts to try Becket in royal courts were met with the archbishop's claims of ecclesiastical immunity. Becket's flight to France in 1164 became a 6-year exile that embarrassed the king before the courts of Europe, while providing the archbishop with a platform for increasingly bitter attacks on royal policy. Meanwhile, Henry's empire required constant attention to maintain its unity. He spent months each year traveling between England, Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine, holding courts, settling disputes, and keeping his various vassals loyal through a combination of justice, generosity, and strategic intimidation. His court was perpetually in motion, a traveling circus of administrators, judges, clerks, and courtiers that could descend on any settlement with little warning and transform it temporarily into the center of an empire. The king's marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, 11 years his senior and previously married to Louis VII of France, was both a diplomatic triumph and a personal catastrophe. Eleanor brought vast territories and sophisticated court culture, but also a network of troubadours, poets, and political intriguers who made the Angevin court a center of literary innovation and romantic intrigue. Their relationship produced 8 children but deteriorated into mutual hostility that would eventually tear the empire apart. Henry's administrative innovations extended far beyond legal reform. The development of a professional civil service, staffed by educated clerks rather than feudal vassals, created governmental continuity that survived individual kings. The expansion of written records, from charter rolls to pipe rolls to patent rolls, documented royal government with unprecedented thoroughness. The systematic assessment of taxation, building on Domesday Book but extending its principles, provided the crown with financial resources that dwarfed those available to any contemporary European ruler. The Great Rebellion of 1173–74, when Eleanor and 3 of Henry's sons joined with Louis VII of France to partition the Angevin Empire, tested these administrative innovations under extreme pressure. While Henry campaigned in Normandy against his eldest son, Henry the Young King, his officials in England suppressed Scottish invasion and baronial revolt with efficiency that demonstrated how thoroughly royal government had been institutionalized. The capture of the King of Scotland at Alnwick and the defeat of rebel barons from Yorkshire to Kent showed that the kingdom could defend itself even when its king was absent. But it was the death of Thomas Becket on December 29, 1170, that cast the longest shadow over Henry's reign. The Archbishop's murder in Canterbury Cathedral, committed by 4 knights who claimed to act on the king's wishes, transformed a political dispute into a spiritual crisis. Whether Henry's angry words "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" were meant as literal commands or mere expressions of frustration, became irrelevant once Becket lay bleeding before the altar of Christ Church. The immediate aftermath of the murder revealed Henry's political skills at their most sophisticated. He submitted to papal legates, accepted responsibility for creating the circumstances that led to Becket's death, and agreed to public penance that included being scourged by the monks of Canterbury. This careful choreography of contrition deflected calls for interdict or excommunication, while actually strengthening royal authority by demonstrating that even kings were subject to divine justice. Becket's canonization in 1173, barely 3 years after his death, created England's most popular saint and Canterbury's most profitable shrine. Pilgrims from across Europe brought offerings that enriched the cathedral and enhanced England's international reputation. The cult of St. Thomas became a source of spiritual pride and economic prosperity that would endure for centuries, ironically benefiting the kingdom of the king who had been responsible for the martyr's death. Henry's final years were shadowed by family conflicts that mirrored the broader tensions within his empire. His sons, impatient for inheritance and encouraged by their mother Eleanor, rebelled repeatedly against paternal authority. The young king's death in 1183, followed by Geoffrey's death in a tournament 3 years later, simplified the succession but intensified the rivalry between the remaining sons, Richard and John. The king's death at Chinon in July 1189, abandoned by most of his courtiers and facing rebellion from his son Richard, allied with Philip Augustus of France, marked the end of the most dynamic reign in medieval English history. Henry had created governmental institutions that would outlast his dynasty, established legal principles that would influence jurisprudence for centuries, and demonstrated that effective administration could unite disparate territories under a single crown. Yet his greatest achievement may have been negative. He had shown that royal authority, however extensive, required constant maintenance and could never be taken for granted. The Angevin Empire began to fragment immediately after his death, but the governmental systems he had established in England provided the foundation for a kingdom that would eventually surpass his own territorial achievements through very different means. Richard I, the faraway king. In the autumn of 1189, a crown passed to a man who would barely know the weight of it upon English soil. Richard, called the Lionheart, inherited a realm that would see precious little of its king, for his heart lay not in the green fields of England but in the dust and heat of distant Jerusalem. Here was a monarch whose legend would far outshine the brief shadows he cast across his own kingdom. Picture Richard in those early days of kingship, tall, golden-haired, every inch the warrior prince that troubadours would sing of in firelit halls. Yet even as the crown settled upon his brow at Westminster, his thoughts were already turning eastward, toward the Holy Land where Christian and Muslim armies clashed beneath a merciless sun. The Third Crusade beckoned, and Richard heard that call more clearly than any summons from his English subjects. To fund this holy war, Richard transformed England into little more than a treasury to be emptied. Offices were sold, lands were mortgaged, taxes were levied with ruthless efficiency. "I would sell London itself, if I could find a buyer," he reportedly declared, and in those words lay the essence of his kingship, England, as a means to an end, not an end in itself. The realm became a coin to be spent on crusading glory. In 1190, Richard departed England's shores, leaving behind a land he would scarcely see again. The Third Crusade unfolded like some epic poem made flesh the siege of Acre, where Richard's siege engines pounded Muslim walls while disease ravaged both armies. The march down the coast toward Jerusalem, with Saladin's horsemen harrying the Christian flanks like desert wolves. At Arsuf, Richard's heavy cavalry charged through clouds of dust and arrows, scattering the Saracen army in one of the Crusade's few decisive victories. Yet Jerusalem remained beyond reach. Though Richard came close enough to glimpse its walls, the holy city stayed in Muslim hands. The king who had travelled so far, spent so much, fought so hard, would never set foot in the place that had drawn him across half the known world. Instead, he negotiated a treaty with Saladin, that courteous enemy, who had become almost a friend across the battlefield's divide. Christian pilgrims could visit the holy sites. The coastal cities would remain in Frankish hands. It was compromise, not conquest, but perhaps it was wisdom too. The journey home proved as perilous as any battle. Shipwrecked in the Adriatic, Richard found himself travelling overland through the territories of Duke Leopold of Austria, man he had grievously insulted during the siege of Acre. Despite disguises and false names, the English king was recognized and seized. What followed was imprisonment in the castle of Dürnstein, high above the Danube, where legend says the faithful minstrel Blondel discovered his master by singing their secret song beneath the tower walls. Leopold sold his royal prisoner to Emperor Henry VI, and Henry demanded a ransom that staggered even medieval imaginations, 150,000 marks of silver, equivalent to twice England's annual royal revenue. Back in England, Queen Eleanor marshalled the realm's resources with iron determination. Churches gave their treasures, nobles pledged their lands, and common folk contributed what little they could. The weight of silver that eventually travelled to Germany represented the sacrifice of an entire kingdom for one man's freedom. Richard returned to England in March 1194, after nearly 4 years away. He stayed just long enough to be crowned again. His imprisonment had technically ended his reign and to raise fresh funds for new campaigns. By May, he was gone once more, this time to defend his French territories against the ambitious Philip Augustus. The Angevin Empire stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees, but it required constant vigilance to maintain, and Richard spent his final years in an endless cycle of siege and counter-siege, building the mighty fortress of Château Gaillard to guard the approaches to Normandy. Death came suddenly in 1199, at the minor siege of Chalus in the Limousin. A crossbow bolt from the castle walls found its mark, and England's absent king faced his final absence. As Richard lay dying, he displayed the chivalry that had made him legendary, pardoning the crossbowman who had delivered the fatal shot. Yet even this act of mercy was undone by his followers, who flayed the man alive once their king had breathed his last. So ended Richard the Lionheart, a king who spent perhaps 6 months of his 10-year reign in England, yet whose legend blazed across centuries. He was the king of romance and song, the Christian warrior whose name struck fear into Saracen hearts, the absent hero whose very absence somehow enhanced his mystique. England had gained a legend but lost a king, and in that exchange lay both triumph and tragedy. John, Magna Carta's accidental father. When Richard's brother John took the crown in 1199, few could have predicted that this least beloved of medieval kings would father England's most enduring constitutional document. Yet history has a way of drawing greatness from unlikely sources, and John's very failures would forge the foundation stones of English liberty. John Lackland, they had called him in youth, the youngest son for whom no inheritance had been set aside. Now, through his brother's death and his nephew's murder, he found himself master of the greatest empire in Western Europe. The Angevin territories stretched from the Cheviot Hills to the Mediterranean, but they would not long remain under John's increasingly desperate grasp. The loss began almost immediately. Philip Augustus of France, that most patient and calculating of monarchs, had spent years probing the defences of Normandy. Where Richard had held the French king at bay through force of arms and reputation, John inspired neither fear nor respect. The great fortress of Château Gaillard, Richard's proudest creation, fell after a siege that revealed John's fundamental weakness. He was never where he needed to be, never ready with the reinforcements that might have turned the tide. By 1204, Normandy was lost. Anjou followed, then most of Poitou. The continental empire that had been built over decades crumbled in just 5 years, leaving John with England, Ireland, and a burning desire to reclaim what he had lost. But reconquest required money, and money required taxes, and taxes required the consent of men who were growing increasingly weary of their king's demands. John possessed a restless, suspicious intelligence that might have served him well in different circumstances. He was learned, spoke several languages, and took a genuine interest in the administration of justice when it suited his purposes. Yet these very qualities became sources of weakness when coupled with his paranoid temperament and explosive rages. He trusted no one completely and was trusted by none in return, creating a court atmosphere thick with suspicion and resentment. The king's conflicts with the church only deepened his isolation. When Stephen Langton was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, John refused to accept him, leading to a bitter dispute with Pope Innocent III. For 5 years, England lay under papal interdict. No masses could be said, no church bells rung, no Christian burials performed in consecrated ground. The very silence of the churches seemed to reproach the king who had brought this spiritual desolation upon his people. Meanwhile, John's attempts to recover his French territories grew ever more desperate and expensive. Expeditions were planned and abandoned, alliances forged and broken, treasures amassed and squandered. The king's demands for military service and financial support met with increasing resistance from nobles who saw little benefit in campaigns that seemed doomed from the start. When John's great coalition against Philip Augustus collapsed at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214, even his most loyal supporters began to question whether this king deserved their continued obedience. The breaking point came in the winter of 1214. A group of northern barons, led by Robert Fitzwalter, began meeting in secret, drawing up lists of grievances that had accumulated over 15 years of John's reign. They spoke not just of excessive taxation and military failures, but of deeper concerns about the arbitrary nature of royal power itself. John's reign had shown them what happened when a king acknowledged no limits on his authority, and they were determined to impose such limits by force if necessary. By spring 1215, the realm teetered on the edge of civil war. The rebel barons had taken control of London, while John gathered his mercenaries and foreign allies at Winchester. Yet both sides recognized that continued conflict would benefit only England's enemies. Through the mediation of Archbishop Langton and other moderate voices, negotiations began that would lead both parties to a meadow beside the Thames called Runnymede. What transpired there in June 1215 was unprecedented in European history. A king, faced with armed rebellion, agreed to accept written limitations on his power. The document that emerged from those tense negotiations was not called Magna Carta at first. That grand title would come later. To contemporaries, it was simply the Charter, a practical agreement designed to end an immediate crisis. Yet within its 63 clauses lay principles that would echo through the centuries. The king could not levy taxes without consent. No free man could be imprisoned or punished, except by the lawful judgment of his peers. Justice could not be sold, denied, or delayed. These were not abstract philosophical principles but urgent practical reforms, born from specific grievances against a specific king. John sealed the charter with reluctance and almost immediately sought to have it annulled. Within months, he was dead, struck down by dysentery at Newark Castle as civil war raged around him. Perhaps it was fitting that this most chaotic of reigns should end in chaos, yet from that chaos emerged something extraordinary. The Great Charter survived its creator's death, was reissued by his young son's regency, and gradually transformed from a feudal peace treaty into the foundation stone of constitutional government. Standing in that water meadow at Runnymede, watching the parchment change hands beneath the summer sky, few could have imagined they were witnessing the birth of an idea that would spread across oceans and centuries. John had intended only to buy peace with his rebellious barons, but he had inadvertently established the principle that even kings must bow before the law. The Magna Carta was indeed his accidental gift to history, proof that sometimes the greatest achievements spring from the most reluctant hands. Henry III, rebuilder of abbeys. 9 years old when the crown passed to him, Henry III began his reign as a child king surrounded by the shadows of civil war and the echoes of his father's failures. Yet from this unpromising beginning would emerge one of England's great builder kings, a monarch whose vision would transform the very stones of Westminster, and whose long reign would witness the slow, sometimes painful birth of parliamentary government. The early years passed in a haze of regency councils and careful guardianship. William Marshal, that flower of medieval chivalry, guided the realm through Henry's minority with a steady hand, while the young king learned the arts of kingship in relative peace. When Henry finally took personal control of government in 1227, England had enjoyed more stability than it had known for decades. Yet stability, as Henry would discover, brought its own challenges. Henry possessed an aesthetic sensibility rare among medieval monarchs. Where his predecessors had built for defense or display, Henry built for beauty and devotion. His greatest passion was Westminster Abbey, that ancient foundation where Saxon kings had once been crowned. The existing Norman structure seemed crude and outdated to Henry's refined tastes. In its place, he envisioned something that would rival the soaring cathedrals of France, a building that would reflect both divine glory and royal magnificence. Work began in the 1240s on what would become one of Europe's architectural masterpieces. Henry threw himself into every detail with the enthusiasm of a master craftsman. He specified the placement of windows, the carving of capitals, the mixing of colors for painted walls. The new abbey rose in the Gothic style, its pointed arches reaching heavenward like stone prayers, its walls dissolved into vast expanses of colored glass that bathed the interior in jeweled light. The king's building projects extended far beyond Westminster. Wherever Henry traveled, he left behind traces of his artistic vision: new chambers decorated with murals, gardens planted with exotic flowers, chapels adorned with golden altarpieces. At the Tower of London, he built apartments for the royal family, complete with private chambers and a menagerie that housed lions, leopards, and an elephant gifted by the King of France. Yet this passion for beauty came at a cost that England's barons increasingly resented. Henry's artistic projects consumed vast sums while the realm's practical needs went unmet. Military failures in France drained the treasury without result, while the king's favoritism toward foreign courtiers, particularly his wife's relatives from Provence, created resentment among the English nobility. The crisis came to a head in the 1250s when Henry's half-brothers from Poitou arrived at court, demanding lands and offices that the king was all too willing to grant. To fund his continental ambitions and satisfy his relatives' appetites, Henry requested unprecedented subsidies from his subjects. Parliament, which had evolved from the great councils of earlier reigns, proved increasingly reluctant to comply without guarantees of reform. Simon de Montfort emerged as the leader of the opposition. Earl of Leicester, through his marriage to Henry's sister, Simon possessed the credentials to challenge royal policy without appearing treasonous. He was also a man of genuine ability, having governed Gascony with remarkable success and led a crusade in southern France. When diplomatic pressure failed to curb Henry's excesses, Simon and his allies resorted to more drastic measures. The Provisions of Oxford in 1258 marked the first attempt to establish permanent limitations on royal authority since Magna Carta. A council of 15 barons would oversee royal policy, approve major appointments, and control government finances. For a brief moment, it seemed that England might develop into a limited monarchy centuries before such ideas triumphed elsewhere in Europe. Henry, however, had inherited something of his father's stubbornness, along with his artistic temperament. In 1261, he repudiated the provisions and sought papal absolution from his oaths. What followed was civil war, though conducted on a more civilized level than the brutal conflicts of John's reign. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Louis in 1264, where Simon's forces captured the king and his eldest son Edward. For 15 months, Simon de Montfort ruled England in all but name. His Parliament of 1265 was remarkably inclusive for its time, including not only nobles and clergy, but also representatives from the towns and shires. It was a bold experiment in representative government, yet it rested on the fragile foundation of military victory and royal captivity. The end came swiftly when Prince Edward escaped captivity and raised a new royal army. At Evesham, on a hot August day in 1265, Simon's forces were surrounded and annihilated. The Earl himself fought to the death, his body so mutilated by his enemies that it could barely be identified. Henry, rescued from the battlefield, wept genuine tears for his brother-in-law, recognizing perhaps that something noble had died with Simon in the summer grass. The king's final years were marked by a gradual reconciliation with his former enemies and a return to his beloved building projects. The new Westminster Abbey neared completion, its soaring vault a testament to Henry's vision and England's wealth. When Parliament met in its new chamber, representatives sat beneath stone angels and painted stars, surrounded by beauty that transformed even mundane political business into something approaching the sacred. Henry died in 1272, after a reign of 56 years that had witnessed profound changes in English government. The principle that kings must govern with the consent of their subjects had been established, even if the practice remained imperfect. Parliament had evolved from an occasional gathering of great lords into a more regular institution that included voices from across the realm. As his body was laid to rest in the abbey he had rebuilt, Henry III left behind a complex legacy. He had been a failure as a warrior king, yet his very weakness had opened space for constitutional development. His artistic patronage had beautified England while burdening it with debt, yet those same buildings would inspire generations of subjects to take pride in their realm. In death, as in life, Henry remained a paradox the king, whose greatest achievements sprang from his most conspicuous failures. Henry I, keeping the kingdom tidy. Henry, the youngest son of the conqueror, possessed what his elder brothers notably lacked, a talent for patient, methodical governance. Where Robert Curthose was charming but ineffective, and William Rufus was capable but abrasive, Henry combined administrative skill with just enough political cunning to turn his unexpected inheritance into a remarkably successful reign. His rapid seizure of the crown following his brother's death in the New Forest showed planning and decisiveness that would characterize the next 35 years. The new king's first challenge was legitimacy. Robert Curthose, returning from the First Crusade, crowned with glory and laden with relics, had a stronger claim by primogeniture and the backing of many Norman barons who held lands in both England and Normandy. Henry's response was characteristically shrewd. He courted English support by marrying Edith, daughter of Malcolm III of Scotland and great-granddaughter of Edmund Ironside, the last native English king before the conquest. This alliance with the old English royal house outraged Norman nobles, who mockingly called the royal couple Godric and Godjifu, after common English peasant names, but it gave Henry's rule a legitimacy that went deeper than mere conquest. The Charter of Liberties that Henry issued at his coronation proved even more significant in the long term. This document, promising to end his brother's harsh financial practices and respect traditional rights, became a model for later constitutional developments. Henry pledged to stop selling church offices, to limit the exploitation of feudal incidents, and to restore the good laws of Edward the Confessor. While he didn't always honor these promises in practice, the very act of putting royal promises in writing established a precedent that would echo through Magna Carta to the constitutional settlements of later centuries. Henry's administrative innovations transformed English government from a personal household system into something approaching a modern bureaucracy. The Exchequer, meeting twice yearly at Winchester and Westminster, developed sophisticated accounting methods using a checkered cloth that gave the institution its name. Royal justices began to travel regular circuits, bringing consistent legal procedures to every corner of the kingdom. The Royal Chancery, producing an unprecedented volume of writs and charters, created a paper trail of government that historians still marvel at today. The king's approach to personnel management was equally systematic. Unlike his predecessors, who relied heavily on great nobles and church leaders, Henry promoted talented men of modest birth who owed their positions entirely to royal favor. Roger of Salisbury, born a simple parish priest, became the most powerful man in England after the king himself, developing the administrative systems that would outlast the Norman dynasty. These new men had no independent power base and thus remained loyal to the crown that had elevated them. Henry's military campaigns showed the same methodical planning that characterized his domestic policies. The conquest of Normandy from his brother Robert took 6 years of careful preparation, diplomatic isolation of his enemy, and systematic reduction of key fortresses. The decisive battle at Tinchebray in 1106 was less a glorious charge than a well-executed tactical plan that left Robert a prisoner for the remaining 28 years of his life. Henry had reunited his father's dominions, but through patient strategy rather than dramatic gestures. The king's personal life reflected his practical approach to royal responsibilities. Though devoted to his wife Edith, whom he rechristened Matilda for Norman ears, Henry acknowledged at least 20 illegitimate children by various mistresses. This wasn't mere royal self-indulgence but calculated dynasty building. These children became valuable diplomatic assets, married into noble families across Britain and northern France to cement political alliances. His illegitimate son Robert became Earl of Gloucester and one of the most trusted advisors in the kingdom. The prosperity that England enjoyed under Henry's rule became legendary among later generations. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, usually sparing with praise for Norman kings, admitted that merchants could travel safely with bags of gold and that no man dared harm another in the king's peace. This security wasn't accidental but the result of systematic legal reforms that extended royal justice into areas previously governed by local custom. Henry's sheriffs were chosen for competence rather than birth, and held accountable through regular audits at the Exchequer. The king's relationship with the church, carefully managed after his brother's mistakes, achieved a workable compromise between royal authority and ecclesiastical independence. The Concordat of London in 1107 resolved the investiture controversy that had poisoned relations between crown and church. Bishops would do homage to the king for their temporal lands while receiving their spiritual authority from the Pope. This pragmatic solution became a model for similar agreements across Europe. But Henry's greatest triumph contained the seeds of future disaster. His only legitimate son, William Etheling, was everything a medieval king could want in an heir: brave, intelligent, pious, and beloved by the nobility. The prince's death in the White Ship disaster of 1120 shattered not just a father's heart but the kingdom's stability. The ship, crossing from Normandy to England on a calm November evening, struck a rock and sank within sight of Barfleur harbour. Only one man survived to tell the tale of how England's future king drowned within swimming distance of shore. Henry's response to this catastrophe showed both his political acumen and his human limitations. He remarried within months, hoping desperately for another son, but his new wife bore only disappointment. The king then took the unprecedented step of naming his daughter Matilda as his heir, extracting oaths of loyalty from his barons, despite their obvious reluctance to accept female rule. When Matilda married Geoffrey of Anjou, the future Henry II's father, it seemed that succession was secured through the legitimate line. Yet Henry's death at Lyon-la-Forêt in December 1135, allegedly from eating a surfeit of lampreys, despite his physician's warnings, left behind a kingdom whose future was far from certain. The oaths sworn to Matilda proved worthless when Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, seized the crown with the support of barons who preferred a king they could potentially control over a queen married to their traditional Angevin enemies. Henry I's legacy was the transformation of Norman England from a conquered territory into an efficiently governed kingdom that could compete with any power in Europe. His administrative systems survived the civil war that followed his death and provided the foundation for the even greater achievements of his grandson Henry II. He had shown that royal government could be both strong and systematic, that efficiency could coexist with justice, and that a kingdom could prosper under a ruler who understood that power was most secure when it served the broader interests of the realm. Edward II, a king out of step. The crown that passed to Edward of Caernarfon in July 1307 carried with it the accumulated weight of his father's towering achievements and unfinished ambitions. Yet the young man who inherited the throne seemed almost designed by fate to disappoint every expectation that his lineage had created. Where Edward I had been commanding, his son appeared weak. Where the father had been focused, the son seemed distracted. Where Longshanks had inspired respect even from his enemies, Edward II would struggle to command loyalty even from his friends. From the beginning, the new king's priorities mystified his contemporaries. While urgent matters of state demanded attention, the Scottish War remained unfinished. Royal finances were strained, and the nobility expected decisive leadership. Edward II appeared more interested in the company of his favourites than the responsibilities of kingship. Chief among these favourites was Piers Gaveston, a young Gascon knight whose charm and wit had captivated the prince during his father's lifetime. Gaveston's influence over the new king transcended the normal bounds of royal friendship. Edward showered him with lands, titles, and treasures that properly belonged to the ancient nobility of England. When the king created Gaveston Earl of Cornwall, a title traditionally reserved for members of the royal family, the gesture struck the barons as both unprecedented and insulting. Here was a foreign upstart being elevated above men whose ancestors had served English kings for centuries. The favourite's own behaviour only intensified noble resentment. Gaveston possessed a sharp tongue and a taste for mockery that he exercised freely at the expense of England's greatest lords. Thomas of Lancaster became the churl in Gaveston's private vocabulary, while the Earl of Warwick was dismissed as the black dog of Arden. Such insults might have been forgiven from a man of appropriate rank, but from a Gascon knight who owed everything to royal favour, they were intolerable. By 1310, the barons' patience had reached its limit. Following the precedent established during Henry III's reign, they forced Edward to accept a committee of Lords Ordainers who would reform the government and remove evil councillors. The ordinances they produced in 1311 represented a comprehensive attempt to limit royal power, but their most immediate demand was simple: Gaveston must go. Edward complied with apparent reluctance, sending his favourite into Irish exile, but within months, Gaveston was back at court. The king's inability to abandon his friend, even at the cost of civil peace, revealed the fundamental weakness of his character. Where stronger kings had learned to subordinate personal preferences to political necessity, Edward II remained a prisoner of his own emotions. The end came swiftly and brutally. In 1312, Gaveston was seized by the Earl of Warwick while travelling under what he believed was safe conduct. Within days, the favourite was dead, executed on Blacklow Hill by men who had grown weary of royal favouritism. Edward's grief was profound and public, but it was also politically disastrous. A king who wept so openly for a friend had revealed himself as a man who might weep for anything. The Scottish situation, meanwhile, deteriorated with alarming speed. Robert Bruce, that most persistent of Edward I's enemies, had used the confusion following the old king's death to consolidate his position north of the border. Castle after castle fell to Scottish forces, until only Stirling remained in English hands. Edward's response was characteristically ill-conceived. A massive military expedition designed more to restore royal prestige than to achieve strategic objectives. The army that marched north in 1314 was one of the largest England had ever assembled. Heavy cavalry, longbowmen, Welsh spearmen, and Irish infantry converged on the Scottish border in numbers that should have guaranteed victory. Yet numbers alone could not compensate for poor leadership and worse planning. At Bannockburn, on Midsummer's Day, Edward's host collided with Bruce's carefully positioned forces in a battle that would echo through Scottish memory for centuries. The defeat was comprehensive and humiliating. English knights found themselves trapped in marshy ground, unable to deploy their heavy horses effectively, while Scottish schiltrons bristling with long spears advanced with disciplined precision. Edward himself barely escaped capture, fleeing the field so precipitously that he left behind his seal, his banner, and any remnant of his military reputation. Bannockburn's aftermath revealed the full extent of Edward's political isolation. Thomas of Lancaster, the king's cousin and most powerful subject, used the military disaster to impose new restrictions on royal authority. For several years, Lancaster effectively ruled England, while Edward retreated into private pleasures, surrounding himself with new favourites who proved as unpopular as their predecessors. The emergence of Hugh Despenser the Younger as the king's latest obsession triggered a fresh cycle of baronial opposition. Unlike Gaveston, who had been merely grasping, Despenser was genuinely dangerous, intelligent, ambitious, and utterly ruthless in pursuit of power. His family's lands in Wales provided a base for territorial expansion that soon brought them into conflict with the Marcher lords, those semi-independent barons who had carved out their own principalities along the Welsh frontier. The war that erupted in 1321 between the Despensers and their enemies marked the beginning of Edward's final crisis. For once, the king showed something approaching resolution, standing by his favourites despite widespread opposition. When Thomas of Lancaster rose in rebellion, claiming to defend the realm against evil counsellors, Edward met the challenge with unexpected vigour. The Battle of Boroughbridge in 1322 saw Lancaster's forces scattered by royalist troops, and the great Earl himself taken prisoner. His execution at Pontefract carried out on the same hill where Gaveston had died marked Edward's moment of triumph, but it was a victory that solved nothing. The fundamental problems of the reign remained: a king who could not inspire loyalty or respect, favourites who enriched themselves at the realm's expense, and a nobility that had lost faith in royal leadership. The final act began when Queen Isabella, Edward's long-neglected wife, travelled to France on a diplomatic mission and refused to return. Her alliance with Roger Mortimer, an exiled Marcher lord, provided the focus for opposition that transcended mere baronial faction. Here was the king's own wife, mother of his heir, declaring that England under the Despensers had become uninhabitable for honest people. The invasion came in 1326, launched from the Low Countries with a force so small that it seemed almost insulting. Yet England's response revealed the depth of Edward's unpopularity. City after city opened its gates to Isabella, while the king's supporters melted away like morning mist. The Despensers' brutal execution at Hereford provided a grim counterpoint to the celebrations that greeted the Queen's progress. Edward's own end came more quietly. Deposed by Parliament in favour of his young son, the former king was moved from castle to castle until he arrived at Berkeley in Gloucestershire. There, in September 1327, he died under circumstances that remain mysterious. The official account spoke of natural causes, but whispered rumours told darker tales of red-hot irons and agonizing death. Perhaps it was fitting that Edward II's end should be shrouded in uncertainty, for his entire reign had been marked by confusion and contradiction. A king who longed for simple friendship in a world that demanded political calculation. He had been destroyed by his inability to separate personal affection from public duty. In Berkeley Castle's quiet chambers, the last Plantagenet king to die by violence passed into history, leaving behind a cautionary tale of kingship undone by human weakness. The bells that tolled across England for Edward II's death marked the end of more than one man's troubled reign. They announced the conclusion of an era when personal monarchy, for better or worse, had shaped the destiny of nations. The future would belong to kings who understood that crowns were institutions as well as ornaments, and that successful rule required the subordination of private desire to public necessity. Edward III came to the throne as a boy of 14, pushed forward by his mother Isabella and her lover Mortimer after they'd disposed of his father in rather grim circumstances at Berkeley Castle. But don't worry too much about young Edward's early years being shaped by regicide and palace coups. These things had a way of working themselves out in medieval politics, usually with someone ending up dangling from a rope or meeting a sword in a dark corridor. By 1330, Edward had quietly arranged for Mortimer to be arrested at Nottingham Castle, because apparently teenagers in the 14th century didn't just slam doors and write angry poetry, they staged their own counter-coups. What emerged from this rather dramatic adolescence was one of England's most successful warrior kings, though success in the 14th century often meant leaving a trail of burned French villages and empty English coffers. Edward had his eye on the French throne, you see, through his mother's side of the family tree, and in 1337 he decided to make his claim official. This began what historians cheerfully call the 100 Years' War, though it actually lasted longer than that, because medieval people were apparently as bad at naming things as they were at keeping accurate time. The early campaigns went rather well for Edward. There was Sluys in 1340, where English longbowmen turned the French fleet into expensive driftwood, and Crécy in 1346, where those same longbowmen demonstrated that French knights in shiny armour made excellent pincushions. Edward's son, the Black Prince, was making quite a name for himself too, wandering around southwestern France with his own army, collecting ransoms and burning things in that casual way that passed for diplomacy in those days. But Edward wasn't just about warfare, he had a keen sense for the theatrical side of kingship. In 1348, he founded the Order of the Garter, that most exclusive of knightly clubs, supposedly after a lady dropped her garter at a court dance and Edward gallantly picked it up, declaring, "Honi soit qui mal y pense," shame on him who thinks evil of it. Whether this actually happened or was just good medieval marketing, the order became the pinnacle of chivalric achievement, and knights would spend small fortunes trying to impress Edward enough to earn their blue garter. The tournaments at Edward's court were legendary affairs, with knights from across Europe coming to joust and feast, and generally prance about in expensive armor. These weren't just sporting events. They were elaborate theatrical productions where nobles could play at being Arthurian heroes while musicians played and ladies watched from silk-draped pavilions. The whole thing cost enormous amounts of money, but it did wonders for England's reputation as a centre of courtly culture. Then, in 1348, just as Edward was enjoying his military successes and chivalric pageantry, something rather more serious arrived from the continent. The Black Death crept quietly into English ports, probably aboard merchant ships from Calais or Bordeaux, and within months it was spreading through the countryside like spilled ink on parchment. Villages that had bustled with harvest activity in August were silent by Christmas, their churches echoing with memorial masses for entire families. The plague changed everything, really. Suddenly there weren't enough people to work the fields, so those who survived could demand better wages and working conditions. The old feudal certainties began to crack. Lords found their serfs walking away to seek better opportunities elsewhere, and there wasn't much they could do about it when half their neighbours were dead, and the other half were too busy burying people to enforce the old laws. Edward aged through these years of triumph and catastrophe, his red-gold hair turning white, his legendary energy gradually fading into the careful movements of an old warrior who'd seen too many battles. By the 1360s, he was leaving more of the governing to his sons and spending his time in comfortable manor houses, playing chess and listening to minstrels sing about the great victories of his youth. When he died in 1377, he left behind a kingdom that was very different from the one he'd inherited. Wealthier from French ransoms, prouder of its military reputation, but also emptied by plague and beginning to question the old certainties about how society should work. Richard II. Richard was only 10 when his grandfather Edward III died, which meant England once again had a child king to manage. His father, the Black Prince, had died the year before, worn out by campaigning in Spain and France, so the crown passed to this golden-haired boy who showed more interest in art and ceremony than in sword practice. The kingdom was administered by a council of uncles and bishops, but real power seemed to flow toward whoever could manage the boy king's moods and interests. The first great test came in 1381, when the common people decided they'd had quite enough of paying taxes for wars they didn't win and supporting lords who contributed mainly decorative value to society. The peasants' revolt began in Essex and Kent, sparked by yet another poll tax, but it quickly became something larger, a fundamental questioning of why some people got to live in castles while others slept in ditches. The rebels marched on London, led by figures like Wat Tyler and John Ball, that radical priest who preached that when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? They burned the Savoy Palace, stormed the Tower of London, and generally made it clear that the social contract needed some serious renegotiation. Young Richard, barely 14, rode out to meet them at Smithfield, where Tyler was struck down during negotiations. Whether by accident or design, nobody could quite agree afterward. What happened next was either very brave or very foolish, depending on your perspective. Richard spurred his horse toward the angry crowd and declared himself their leader, promising to address their grievances. The rebels, perhaps more shocked than satisfied, gradually dispersed. Of course, most of Richard's promises were quietly forgotten once the immediate danger passed, but the young king had shown he could think quickly under pressure. As Richard grew into his 20s, his court became increasingly sophisticated and artistic. He patronized poets like Geoffrey Chaucer, commissioned elaborate manuscripts, and developed a taste for fine clothing and ceremonial display that made Edward III's tournaments look rather provincial. The Wilton diptych, that exquisite portable altarpiece showing Richard being presented to the Virgin Mary by his patron saints, captures something of the ethereal, almost otherworldly quality he cultivated. But Richard's artistic sensibilities came with political costs. He surrounded himself with favorites who owed their positions to his favor rather than their birth or achievements, which naturally irritated the established nobility. When he elevated men like Robert de Vere to positions of great influence, the older aristocrats began to mutter about proper governance and the need for kings to consult their natural advisors. The tensions came to a head in the late 1380s when a group of nobles known as the Lords Appellant essentially staged a coup, forcing Richard to dismiss his favorites and submit to their oversight. For a few years, Richard appeared to accept this arrangement, but he was quietly planning his revenge. In 1397, he struck back, arresting or exiling his former opponents and reasserting his authority with interest. This might have worked if Richard had been content with victory, but he seemed determined to rule as an absolute monarch in a kingdom that still expected consultation and consensus. He raised taxes without parliamentary approval, confiscated lands on flimsy pretexts, and generally behaved as though being king meant never having to explain yourself to anyone. The end came swiftly in 1399, when Henry Bolingbroke, whom Richard had exiled, returned to reclaim his confiscated inheritance. What began as a property dispute quickly became a political revolution, as nobles and commons alike rallied to Bolingbroke's cause. Richard, returning from a campaign in Ireland, found himself abandoned by all but a handful of supporters. By autumn, he was a prisoner in the Tower of London, forced to abdicate in favour of his cousin Henry. He was moved to Pontefract Castle in Yorkshire, where he died in early 1400, officially of natural causes, though whispers of murder followed the news. Richard had reigned for 22 years, but his legacy was the establishment of a precedent that even anointed kings could be removed if they pushed their subjects too far. Henry IV. Henry Bolingbroke became king almost by accident, or at least that's what he liked to claim afterward. He'd returned from exile simply to reclaim his father's duchy of Lancaster, he insisted. But when Richard II proved so universally unpopular and politically tone-deaf, well, what was a loyal Englishman to do but step forward and accept the crown that fate seemed to be offering? Of course, the reality was rather more complicated. Henry was the grandson of Edward III through John of Gaunt, but his claim to the throne wasn't particularly strong. There were others with better hereditary rights. What he had was military support, political skill, and the enormous advantage of not being Richard II. Still, becoming king through deposition meant that his entire reign would be shadowed by questions of legitimacy and the uncomfortable precedent that English kings could be unmade as well as made. The first serious challenge came from Wales, where Owain Glyndwr began what started as a personal quarrel with his English neighbour, but quickly escalated into a full-scale nationalist uprising. Glyndwr was no mere cattle rustler. He was an educated man who'd studied law in London and served in Richard II's army. When he proclaimed himself Prince of Wales in 1400, he could draw on deep wells of Welsh resentment against English rule and English settlers. For the better part of a decade, Glyndwr's forces made life miserable for Henry's armies. The Welsh knew their mountainous country intimately, could vanish into the hills when pursued, and had the passionate support of bards who turned every skirmish into an epic tale. Henry sent expedition after expedition into Wales, burning villages and capturing castles, but Glyndwr himself remained frustratingly elusive, appearing where least expected and disappearing before he could be cornered. The Welsh revolt was serious enough, but it became genuinely dangerous when it connected with English discontent. The Percy family, who'd been crucial in Henry's original victory over Richard, began to have second thoughts about their new king. They controlled much of northern England and had their own grievances about royal finances and Scottish policy. When Harry Hotspur Percy allied with Glyndwr and marched south with an army in 1403, Henry faced the real possibility that his crown might prove as temporary as Richard's had been. The crisis was decided at Shrewsbury, where Henry met the Percy rebels in a savage battle that left thousands dead and Harry Hotspur among them. The king's teenage son, the future Henry V, fought with conspicuous bravery despite taking an arrow in the face, establishing his military reputation early. With the Percys defeated and scattered, the immediate threat to Henry's throne receded, but the underlying tensions remained. Henry's later years were marked by increasing ill health and the gradual transfer of real authority to his capable son. Parliament grew more assertive during this period, demanding regular consultation and attempting to control royal finances more closely. Henry generally accepted these limitations with reasonable grace. He understood that a usurper king needed to be more accommodating than a hereditary one. The Welsh revolt gradually faded after 1408, not through any dramatic military victory, but through exhaustion and the practical difficulties of sustaining a rebellion in poor, mountainous country. Glyndwr himself disappeared into legend, neither captured nor killed, but simply vanishing into the Welsh hills like something from the Mabinogion. His uprising had cost England enormous sums and demonstrated the limits of royal power when faced with determined local resistance. When Henry died in 1413, probably of a stroke in the Jerusalem chamber at Westminster Abbey, he'd managed to establish the Lancastrian dynasty securely enough to pass the crown to his son. It wasn't the most glorious reign in English history, but it was a successful one in the sense that Henry had taken the throne illegally and managed to die in bed with his succession secure. In the complicated mathematics of medieval politics, that counted as a considerable achievement. Henry V. The prince, who became Henry V, had spent his youth learning statecraft in the hardest possible school, governing a kingdom, while his father dealt with rebellions, financial crises, and the lingering questions about Lancastrian legitimacy. By the time he inherited the crown in 1413, aged 26, he'd already commanded armies, negotiated with parliaments, and earned a reputation for both military competence and administrative efficiency. The wild young man of Shakespeare's imagination, carousing with Falstaff in Eastcheap taverns, was largely a Tudor invention. The real Henry was serious, methodical, and deeply pious. His first major decision was to revive English claims to the French throne, dormant since the later years of Richard II. This wasn't mere royal nostalgia. Henry needed to unite his kingdom behind a grand enterprise that would distract from domestic problems and establish his dynasty's credibility through military success. The French were conveniently divided by civil war between the Armagnac and Burgundian factions, making this seem like an opportune moment for intervention. Henry's preparations were meticulous. He rebuilt the English navy, negotiated loans from Italian bankers, stockpiled weapons and supplies, and conducted careful diplomatic negotiations to ensure his continental allies would support his campaign. When Parliament granted him the taxes he needed, it was with genuine enthusiasm. The prospect of French gold and glory appealed to all levels of society. The army that sailed for Normandy in August 1415 was probably the most professional force England had ever assembled. Henry had learned from earlier campaigns that successful medieval warfare required discipline, logistics, and careful planning rather than simply throwing brave men at the enemy and hoping for the best. His soldiers were well equipped, regularly paid, and operating under strict codes of conduct that prohibited unnecessary destruction of churches and abuse of non-combatants. The siege of Harfleur took longer than expected, and dysentery claimed more English lives than French weapons did, but by September the port was in English hands. Henry's famous decision to march to Calais rather than return directly to England was probably motivated by practical concerns. He needed to demonstrate English strength and secure his new conquest, but it led to the encounter that would define his reign and his legend. The French army that intercepted Henry at Agincourt on the 25th of October was much larger than his force, but it was poorly coordinated and overconfident. The English position, between two woods on muddy ground, negated French numerical superiority and played to English strengths. When the French cavalry charged, they found themselves funneled into a killing ground, where English longbowmen could shoot them down systematically. The battle was shorter and more decisive than most medieval engagements. By afternoon, thousands of French nobles lay dead in the mud while English casualties numbered in the dozens. Henry's soldiers spent the evening pulling valuable armor and weapons from French corpses, while French heralds formally acknowledged English victory. It was the kind of overwhelming triumph that medieval people interpreted as divine judgment on the righteousness of Henry's cause. The years following Agincourt saw Henry methodically conquering Normandy, building a coalition of allies, and negotiating the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. This extraordinary document made Henry heir to the French throne and husband to Catherine, daughter of the mad French king Charles VI. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that England and France might be permanently united under Lancastrian rule. Henry's marriage to Catherine was both politically necessary and personally satisfying. Contemporary accounts suggest genuine affection between them. Their son, the future Henry VI, was born in 1421, securing the succession and symbolizing the hoped-for union of the two kingdoms. But Henry himself was already showing signs of the illness that would kill him the following year, probably dysentery contracted during the siege of Meaux. When Henry died at Vincennes in August 1422, just short of his 35th birthday, he'd achieved more in 9 years than most kings managed in decades. He'd united England behind his leadership, conquered much of northern France, and negotiated a treaty that promised lasting peace through dynastic union. His death, coming when his grand design was still incomplete, left his infant son to inherit both the English crown and impossible expectations about French conquest that would ultimately destroy the Lancastrian dynasty. Edward IV. In the soft twilight of medieval England, when the white rose of York finally bloomed triumphant, Edward Plantagenet stepped from the shadows of civil war into a crown that glittered with hard-won authority. The year was 1461, and the realm had grown weary of the gentle, troubled reign of Henry VI. Edward, tall and golden-haired, possessed that particular magnetism that draws men to follow banners into uncertain dawn. The Wars of the Roses had painted England's market towns in crimson and gold, those small battles that echoed through cobbled streets where merchants once hawked their wares in peace. At Towton, fought in swirling Yorkshire snow, Edward's forces carved victory from the frozen fields, and the white rose banner snapped proudly in the bitter wind. The crown passed to younger hands, hands that knew the weight of sword as well as scepter. Edward understood that kingship required more than battlefield courage. In the quiet chambers of Westminster, he cultivated alliances with the merchant princes of London, those shrewd men who counted coins by candlelight and understood that trade built kingdoms more surely than conquest. The Yorkist court began to gleam with a new prosperity, velvet hangings replacing threadbare tapestries, and the gentle clink of gold in royal coffers grew steadier with each passing season. Across the narrow seas, Burgundy beckoned with promises of alliance and trade. The Duke of Burgundy, that most cultured of princes, offered his friendship and his markets to England's new king. Treaties were signed in lamp-lit halls, where wine flowed like diplomatic honey, and marriages were planned to bind nations in silk and ceremony. Edward's sister Margaret would journey to Burgundy as Duchess, her wedding celebrations lasting days in a display of wealth that whispered of England's growing confidence. Yet even golden reigns cast shadows. The Earl of Warwick, who had helped place Edward on his throne, grew restless as the king's independence flourished. In hushed conversations behind closed doors, the great nobleman began to question whether his royal puppet danced to his own tune too freely. The white rose, it seemed, had thorns that even its gardener might feel. Edward's court became a stage for Renaissance splendor, where Italian merchants displayed their finest silks and Flemish artists painted portraits in rich oils that caught the light, like captured sunbeams. The king himself, handsome and tall, moved through his palace halls with an easy grace that spoke of confidence earned in battle and tempered in the gentler arts of statecraft. Ladies whispered behind painted fans, and courtiers bowed low in chambers where the very air seemed to shimmer with prosperity and possibility. Edward V. In the gentle spring of 1483, when apple blossoms dotted England's orchards like scattered prayers, a boy of 12 found himself thrust into a crown too heavy for his young shoulders. Edward V, son of the Golden King who had brought such prosperity to the realm, stood at Westminster, while lords and bishops spoke in hushed tones of his inheritance and the weighty duties that awaited. The young king had spent his childhood in the peaceful chambers of Ludlow Castle, where the Welsh marches rolled away in green waves toward distant mountains. There, surrounded by devoted tutors and the gentle rhythm of castle life, he had learned his letters and listened to tales of chivalry while rain pattered against diamond-paned windows. His world had been one of books and prayers, of morning lessons and evening songs, far from the intricate dances of power that moved through London's shadowed streets. But death had come swiftly to his father, that vital man who had seemed built for decades more of golden rule. In quiet chambers, physicians had whispered of sudden illness and failing strength, while outside the walls of Westminster, England held its breath and waited to learn what shape the future might take. The boy, King's uncle, Richard of Gloucester, arrived from the north with gentle words and protective gestures. The Duke spoke of duty and guardianship, of a realm that needed steady hands while its rightful king grew into his inheritance. Lords nodded thoughtfully in council chambers where tapestries muffled their careful conversations, and plans were laid for a coronation that would bind the kingdom in ceremony and celebration. Yet something whispered wrong in the spring air of 1483. Perhaps it was the way certain lords exchanged glances when they thought no one watched, or the manner in which conversations died when the young king entered rooms where his future was being shaped by other hands. The Tower of London loomed beside the Thames, its ancient stones holding secrets that stretched back through centuries of royal custom and convenience. Edward V took residence in the Tower's royal apartments, those chambers where kings traditionally prepared for their coronations amid comfort and ceremony. His younger brother Richard joined him there, and for a time the two boys could be glimpsed playing in the tower's gardens or walking along its walls while their protectors spoke of crowns and kingdoms in rooms where they could not hear. But spring faded into summer, and the coronation that had been promised seemed to drift further into an uncertain future. In the tower's comfortable chambers, two young princes waited for a ceremony that would never come, while England itself held its breath and wondered what destiny was being written in the shadows of power. The mystery that began in those quiet months would echo through centuries, a question mark written in the margins of history's grand narrative. Richard III. From the northern reaches of England, where the moors roll endlessly under wide skies and ancient castles guard river crossings worn smooth by centuries of passage, Richard Plantagenet had built his reputation on steady governance and unwavering loyalty. The Duke of Gloucester understood the Yorkshire folk, those hardy people who spoke their minds plainly and valued actions over courtly flourishes. In the great castle of Middleham, he had learned the arts of rule not in gilded chambers, but in the practical business of keeping order along England's most troubled frontier. Richard's northern affinity ran deep as roots in Yorkshire soil. These were men who had followed him through Scottish raids and border skirmishes, who knew his voice in battle and trusted his judgment when winter provisions needed counting. They called him their lord not from ceremony but from experience. And when events in London began to unfold like a tapestry with threads too tangled to follow, these northerners would ride south at his summons with the loyalty that binds men to tested leadership. The summer of 1483 brought whispers that rustled through London's streets like autumn leaves before the storm. In chambers where power was negotiated by candlelight, documents were produced that spoke of validity and legitimacy, of marriages that might not have been marriages, and vows that cast long shadows over royal succession. The titulus regius, that careful legal construction, laid out in formal Latin why the young princes could not inherit their father's crown, why bastardy barred the path to throne, and why the kingdom needed a man grown to guide its destiny. Parliament gathered in those hushed summer days, lords, spiritual and temporal, bending their heads over parchments that rewrote the story of royal inheritance. In the measured language of law and precedent, they declared that England needed Richard's steady hand, that governance could not wait for boys to grow into men, while enemies pressed at borders and allies watched for signs of weakness. The coronation that autumn sparkled with all the ceremony that England's crown demanded. In Westminster Abbey, where generations of kings had knelt before altar and archbishop, Richard III received the ancient anointing while his northern followers stood proud among the congregation. Anne Neville, his queen, accepted her own crown with the grace of one born to command, and for a moment it seemed that England had found the steady rule it needed. Yet even as Richard settled into his reign, organizing his kingdom with the same methodical care he had brought to governing the north, whispers of discontent began to gather like storm clouds on distant horizons. Henry Tudor, that Welsh claimant with Lancastrian blood and French backing, watched from Breton exile and counted allies among the disaffected. The web of loyalty that held England together showed signs of strain, as some wondered about the fate of the young princes who had vanished from public view like morning mist before the sun. At Bosworth Field, on an August morning in 1485, when the air hung heavy with the promise of rain, two armies faced each other across Leicestershire's rolling ground. Richard III, last of the Plantagenet line that had ruled England for more than 3 centuries, led his forces with the same courage he had shown in countless northern battles. But loyalty, that most precious currency of medieval kingship, proved as changeable as English weather. When the crucial moment came, when battle hung in the balance like a sword's edge catching light, key supporters melted away or turned their coats, leaving their king to face destiny with diminished forces and a crown that suddenly seemed to weigh more than armor. The last Plantagenet king died as he had lived, fighting with sword in hand, and England's wheel of fortune turned once more toward a new dynasty and different dreams of what the realm might become. Henry VII. From the mists of Welsh legend and the practical calculations of French diplomacy, Henry Tudor emerged to claim a crown that had eluded his grasp through years of careful exile. The man who would become Henry VII had learned patience in the schools of adversity, spending long seasons in Breton courts where every conversation might carry the seeds of opportunity or disaster, where survival itself required the careful cultivation of allies and the delicate navigation of continental politics. Henry understood that crowns were won not only on battlefields but in the quieter chambers where marriages were arranged and treaties signed. Even before Bosworth's dust had settled, he was planning the alliance that would heal England's wounded realm. Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV and living symbol of the White Rose, would become his queen in a marriage that promised to weave together the scattered threads of royal legitimacy. Their union would not be born of passion but of statecraft, yet from this calculated joining would spring a dynasty that would reshape England's destiny. The new king's court reflected his cautious nature and continental experience. Where the Yorkist kings had displayed their wealth in velvet and cloth of gold, Henry VII preferred the subtler arts of accumulation. In chambers where account books lay open beside prayer books, royal clerks calculated the realm's income with the precision of merchants tallying their profits. Every pound sterling that entered the royal treasury was recorded, weighed, and carefully preserved against future need. Henry's marriage diplomacy extended far beyond England's shores, spinning a web of alliances that would bind his upstart dynasty to the established powers of Europe. Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Spain's mighty monarchs, would marry his eldest son Arthur in a ceremony that proclaimed England's arrival among the great powers. When death claimed young Arthur in the soft hills of Wales, Henry smoothly transferred the Spanish alliance to his younger son, demonstrating the calculating pragmatism that marked all his dealings. The Star Chamber, that court of royal prerogative, became Henry's instrument for taming the great nobles who had turned England's wars into their private quarrels. In sessions where the king's justice moved swiftly and surely, overmighty subjects learned that the new regime would tolerate no private armies or local tyrannies. Fines and bonds, those financial fetters that bound noblemen to good behavior, replaced the headsman's axe as tools of royal discipline. Yet Henry's greatest achievement lay not in dramatic gestures, but in the patient accumulation of authority and wealth. Year by year, the royal coffers grew heavier, while potential rebels found themselves isolated and impoverished. The king's agents moved through England's shires like careful gardeners, pruning away the sources of disorder and cultivating the conditions for peaceful succession. When foreign merchants visited English ports, they found a kingdom where law ran steadily and commerce flourished under royal protection. The guild halls of London hummed with activity, and the great fairs of England drew traders from across the narrow seas. Henry understood that prosperity bred loyalty more surely than fear, and he encouraged the patient work of craftsmen and merchants who built wealth coin by coin, transaction by transaction. In the final years of his reign, as Henry VII sat in chambers where account books recorded the fruits of careful governance, England had been transformed from a realm exhausted by civil war into a kingdom ready to take its place among Europe's powers. The treasury held gold enough to fund ambitions, the nobility had been tamed without being destroyed, and most precious of all, the succession seemed secure in the person of young Henry VIII, that vigorous prince who promised to bring new glories to the Tudor name. Henry VIII. In the spring of his reign, When apple blossoms crowned England's orchards and hope seemed to bloom eternal in palace gardens, Henry VIII strode into his inheritance like a young god descended to rule over mortal realms. Tall and broad-shouldered, with red gold hair that caught the light like burnished copper, the second Tudor king possessed that magnetic presence that draws all eyes and commands attention without effort. His father's careful accumulation of wealth and authority had created the perfect stage for a king who understood that majesty required display as well as substance. The court that gathered around this Renaissance prince sparkled with learning and artistry imported from across the Alps. Italian musicians filled the great halls of Hampton Court and Greenwich with melodies that spoke of southern sophistication, while scholars debated questions of theology and philosophy in chambers where the very air seemed charged with intellectual possibility. Henry himself moved through this glittering world as both patron and participant, a king who could match wits with the finest minds of his age, while demonstrating his physical prowess in the tilt-yards where armoured champions met in thunderous collision. But it was in the intricate dance of marriage and succession that Henry's reign would find its most profound and transformative challenges. Catherine of Aragon, that dignified Spanish princess who had been briefly married to his brother Arthur, brought to their wedding bed not only diplomatic alliance, but also the promise of heirs who would secure the Tudor succession. In the early years of their marriage, when love seemed genuine and hopes ran high, the royal couple appeared blessed by fortune and divine favour. Yet as seasons turned and pregnancies ended in disappointment or brief tragedy, the spectre of an heirless crown began to haunt the king's thoughts. Sons were stillborn or died in infancy, leaving only Princess Mary to carry the Tudor bloodline forward. In a realm where female rule remained uncertain and dangerous, Henry's need for a male heir became an obsession that would reshape not only his personal life, but the very foundations of English Christianity. Anne Boleyn entered this drama like a comet blazing across the established order, her dark eyes and quick wit capturing a king's attention in ways that transcended mere physical attraction. The lady who would become Henry's second queen possessed an intellect sharpened by continental education and a will strong enough to refuse a king's advances until he offered marriage rather than mere liaison. In chambers where candlelight flickered across rich tapestries, Henry courted his future bride with poems and promises, while wrestling with the theological implications of his desired freedom from Catherine. The break with Rome began not with grand theological statements, but with a king's personal need dressed in careful scholarship. In libraries where learned men pored over ancient texts, arguments were crafted to demonstrate that Henry's marriage to Catherine had been invalid from its beginning, cursed by divine displeasure and incapable of producing the male heir that England required. When Pope Clement VII proved reluctant to annul a marriage that would offend the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry's patience finally shattered like glass against stone. Thomas Cranmer, that careful scholar elevated to Canterbury's ancient see, provided the ecclesiastical machinery for Henry's revolutionary solution. If Rome would not grant the king his freedom, then England would find its own path to spiritual authority. The Act of Supremacy, passed by a parliament that understood the consequences of opposing royal will, declared Henry VIII the supreme head of the Church of England, answerable to God alone rather than to foreign pontiffs. The dissolution of the monasteries followed like summer thunder after spring lightning. Those ancient communities that had preserved learning and provided charity for centuries, suddenly finding themselves obstacles to royal authority and sources of desperately needed wealth. Across England's countryside, abbey bells fell silent as Henry's commissioners inventoried treasures and evaluated properties that would soon pass into secular hands. The redistribution of monastic wealth created a class of gentlemen whose prosperity depended on the continuation of religious revolution, binding them to the Tudor cause with chains of golden self-interest. Through 6 marriages that became the stuff of legend and cautionary tale, Henry pursued his obsession with legitimate succession while transforming England's relationship with European Christianity. Jane Seymour finally provided the male heir for whom the king had sacrificed so much, though she paid for this gift with her own life in the shadowed chambers of Hampton Court. Prince Edward's birth seemed to vindicate Henry's struggles, offering the promise of peaceful succession and continued Tudor rule. In his final years, as Henry VIII grew heavy with age and indulgence, the kingdom he left behind bore little resemblance to the realm he had inherited from his careful father. England had broken free from Roman authority, embraced religious revolution, and established itself as a power capable of independent action in European affairs. The treasury his father had so carefully filled had been spent on wars and display, but the foundations of a new kind of English greatness had been laid in the ruins of medieval Christendom. Edward IV. In the soft twilight of medieval England, when the white rose of York finally bloomed triumphant, Edward Plantagenet stepped from the shadows of civil war into a crown that glittered with hard-won authority. The year was 1461, and the realm had grown weary of the gentle, troubled reign of Henry VI. Edward, tall and golden-haired, possessed that particular magnetism that draws men to follow banners into uncertain dawn. The Wars of the Roses had painted England's market towns in crimson and gold, those small battles that echoed through cobbled streets where merchants once hawked their wares in peace. At Towton, fought in swirling Yorkshire snow, Edward's forces carved victory from the frozen fields, and the white rose banner snapped proudly in the bitter wind. The crown passed to younger hands, hands that knew the weight of sword as well as scepter. Edward understood that kingship required more than battlefield courage. In the quiet chambers of Westminster, he cultivated alliances with the merchant princes of London, those shrewd men who counted coins by candlelight and understood that trade built kingdoms more surely than conquest. The Yorkist court began to gleam with a new prosperity, velvet hangings replacing threadbare tapestries, and the gentle clink of gold in royal coffers grew steadier with each passing season. Across the narrow seas, Burgundy beckoned with promises of alliance and trade. The Duke of Burgundy, that most cultured of princes, offered his friendship and his markets to England's new king. Treaties were signed in lamp-lit halls, where wine flowed like diplomatic honey, and marriages were planned to bind nations in silken ceremony. Edward's sister Margaret would journey to Burgundy as Duchess, her wedding celebrations lasting days in a display of wealth that whispered of England's growing confidence. Yet even golden reigns cast shadows. The Earl of Warwick, who had helped place Edward on his throne, grew restless as the king's independence flourished. In hushed conversations behind closed doors, the great nobleman began to question whether his royal puppet danced to his own tune too freely. The white rose, it seemed, had thorns that even its gardener might feel. Edward's court became a stage for Renaissance splendor, where Italian merchants displayed their finest silks and Flemish artists painted portraits in rich oils that caught the light, like captured sunbeams. The king himself, handsome and tall, moved through his palace halls with an easy grace that spoke of confidence earned in battle and tempered in the gentler arts of statecraft. Ladies whispered behind painted fans, and courtiers bowed low in chambers where the very air seemed to shimmer with prosperity and possibility. Mary I. From the shadowed chambers where bastardized princesses learned the bitter lessons of survival in courts that had discarded them, Mary Tudor emerged in the summer of 1553 to claim a crown that her father's will had promised and her half-brother's dying efforts had attempted to deny. The daughter of Catherine of Aragon carried within her soul the accumulated grievances of decades spent watching England embrace heresies that had destroyed her mother's marriage and relegated her own birthright to legal uncertainty. Now, at 37, she stood ready to restore the old faith, with the fervour of one who saw God's hand in her unlikely triumph. The brief reign of Lady Jane Grey, that learned Protestant maiden thrust forward by Northumberland's ambitions, crumbled before Mary's legitimate claim like morning mist before advancing sun. In Norfolk's countryside, where common folk still remembered the old ways with nostalgic affection, men rallied to Mary's banner not from theological conviction but from the deeper loyalty that England owed to Henry VIII's firstborn child. The army that escorted Mary to London included both convinced Catholics and political pragmatists who understood that successful rebellions require popular support, not merely noble calculation. Mary's early acts as queen reflected both the mercy that marked her personal character and the political wisdom that recognized England's need for healing after decades of religious upheaval. Lady Jane Grey, that reluctant usurper who had worn the crown for 9 days like an ill-fitting costume, found herself imprisoned in the Tower but alive, while many of Northumberland's supporters discovered that submission brought pardon rather than punishment. For a brief, golden moment, It seemed that England might return to Catholic faith through reconciliation rather than coercion. The Spanish marriage that Mary negotiated with the passionate intensity of a woman who had waited decades for love represented both personal fulfillment and diplomatic revolution. Philip of Spain, heir to the greatest Catholic power in Europe, offered England alliance with the Habsburg Empire while promising Mary the children she desperately needed to secure Catholic succession. In Winchester Cathedral, where Arthur and Catherine of Aragon had been wed half a century earlier, Mary exchanged vows with a husband 11 years her junior, their marriage ceremony conducted with all the splendor that befitted the union of two great Catholic realms. Yet, even as wedding celebrations filled English halls with Spanish music and Habsburg gold, murmurs of discontent began to rustle through London's streets and country parishes. The Protestant reforms of Edward's reign had taken deeper root than Mary perhaps understood, while English suspicion of foreign influence made Philip's presence a constant source of unease. Wyatt's rebellion, that ill-coordinated rising that brought Kentish rebels to London's gates, demonstrated how quickly religious restoration could become entangled with fears of Spanish domination. The executions that followed Wyatt's defeat marked the beginning of persecutions that would stain Mary's reign with blood and earn her the terrible epithet of Bloody Mary in Protestant memory. Lady Jane Grey, that innocent pawn in Northumberland's game, found that mercy had limits when rebellion threatened the realm's stability. In the Tower's courtyard, the learned young woman who had preferred Greek philosophy to royal ceremony met her death with the courage that marked her family's bloodline. Cardinal Pole's return from continental exile brought both spiritual authority and personal reconciliation to Mary's restoration project. The man who had spent decades in Roman service, writing against Henry VIII's policies while maintaining his claim to English loyalty, now found himself welcomed home as the instrument through which England might be reconciled with papal authority. In ceremonies that echoed with medieval splendor, Parliament formally submitted to Rome while bonfires of heretical books lit London's squares with flames that seemed to promise purification. The burnings that began at Smithfield in February 1555 represented Mary's attempt to root out heresy through the traditional means that her predecessors had employed against Lollards and other dissidents. Thomas Cranmer, architect of English Protestantism, faced the flames with less steadiness than expected, his recantations followed by final defiance as fire consumed the hand that had signed submission to Rome. Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley, those Protestant bishops who had helped establish Edward's reforms, met their deaths with the fortitude of martyrs, their final words echoing through later Protestant memory like battle cries against Catholic tyranny. Yet Mary's reign encompassed more than religious persecution, though later Protestant historians would emphasize martyrdom over the quieter achievements of Catholic restoration. The reconciliation with Rome brought intellectual and artistic renewal as scholars and craftsmen who had fled England's religious turmoil began to return from continental exile. Church music regained the complexity and beauty that Protestant simplicity had banished, while the visual arts experienced revival as religious imagery returned to England's chapels and parish churches. The loss of Calais in 1558, that final vestige of England's medieval French Empire, struck Mary with the force of personal catastrophe. For more than 2 centuries, English kings had maintained their foothold on the continental shore as both practical base and symbolic link to the greater realm they claimed across the Channel. When French forces finally captured the fortress that had withstood so many sieges, Mary reportedly declared that Calais would be found written upon her heart after death. So deeply did the loss wound her sense of royal duty. Elizabeth I. In the grey November dawn of 1558, when autumn mists clung to England's rivers and the last roses of the year drooped heavy with dew, Elizabeth Tudor learned that the crown her sister had worn with such passionate conviction had passed to her own young shoulders. At 25, the daughter of Anne Boleyn possessed neither Mary's fervent Catholicism nor Edward's Protestant certainty, but rather a pragmatic intelligence that would prove more valuable than either theological conviction or doctrinal purity in the delicate task of healing England's wounded religious divisions. The settlement that Elizabeth crafted in her first years as queen reflected not the triumph of Protestant militancy, but the careful calculation of a ruler who understood that England needed peace more than theological precision. The act of uniformity that restored Protestant worship did so with studied moderation, requiring attendance at English services while avoiding the fierce denunciations that might drive Catholics into rebellion. In parish churches across the realm, former Marian priests found they could adapt to Elizabeth's requirements without completely abandoning their deeper convictions, while Protestant exiles returning from Geneva and Strasbourg discovered that their queen preferred compromise to confrontation. Elizabeth's religious settlement found its perfect expression in the patient scholarship of Matthew Parker, that moderate cleric who accepted Canterbury's ancient see with reluctance but guided the Elizabethan Church with wisdom earned through decades of careful study. Under Parker's guidance, the Church of England developed its distinctive character as a Reformed Catholicism that retained episcopal structure while embracing Protestant theology, creating space for both evangelical fervor and traditional ceremonial within a single national church. The Queen herself remained an enigma wrapped in royal ceremony, her personal beliefs as carefully guarded as state secrets, while her public devotion to England's Protestant settlement never wavered in its apparent sincerity. In chapel services where courtiers passed every gesture for clues to royal thinking, Elizabeth participated in Reformed worship with the graceful attention that marked all her public performances, while her private prayers remained locked in chambers where only God and sovereign conscience could penetrate. Parliament's persistent efforts to resolve the succession question met with royal responses that danced around commitment like courtly pavane around passion. Elizabeth's courtships became instruments of diplomacy, her potential marriages dangled before foreign princes and domestic nobles with the skill of an angler presenting flies to cautious trout. The Archduke Charles, Eric of Sweden, and various French princes found themselves drawn into elaborate negotiations that promised everything while guaranteeing nothing, their ambassadors discovering that the Virgin Queen's affections proved as elusive as morning fog before the sun. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots in 1587 represented Elizabeth's most agonizing decision, the moment when her careful balance between mercy and necessity finally tilted toward the harsh requirements of state security. For 19 years, the Scottish Queen had remained a prisoner in English castles, her mere existence a perpetual invitation to Catholic conspiracy and foreign intervention. When the Babington plot finally provided irrefutable evidence of Mary's involvement in plans for Elizabeth's assassination, even the Virgin Queen's legendary reluctance to shed royal blood could no longer postpone the inevitable. The Spanish Armada that approached English shores in the summer of 1588 carried more than ships and soldiers. It bore the accumulated resentment of Catholic Europe against England's stubborn heresy and growing maritime power. Philip II, Mary Tudor's widowed husband, who had once hoped to guide England back to Rome through conjugal influence, now sought the same goal through military conquest, his great fleet loaded with priests and prayers, as well as cannon and cavalry. Elizabeth's appearance at Tilbury, where English forces gathered to repel the expected invasion, provided one of those perfect moments when sovereign and subject merged in common cause. Dressed in white velvet and silver armor, mounted on a grey gelding that seemed bred for ceremony, the Virgin Queen addressed her troops with words that rang like bronze bells across the centuries. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." The defeat of the Armada by English seamanship and Atlantic storms confirmed what Elizabeth's subjects had begun to suspect, that their queen enjoyed special divine protection, that England itself had become God's chosen nation in the struggle against papal tyranny. In Thanksgiving services across the realm, congregations sang psalms of deliverance, while preachers proclaimed that the winds and waves themselves fought for Protestant England against Catholic Spain. Yet Elizabeth's greatest achievement lay not in military triumph, but in the patient cultivation of English culture during 4 decades of relative peace. In playhouses where companies of actors performed before audiences that ranged from groundlings to courtiers, a new dramatic literature began to flourish under royal patronage and protection. William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and their contemporaries found in Elizabethan England the freedom to explore human nature with unprecedented depth and complexity. Their works, reflecting a society confident enough in its own identity to examine its contradictions without fear. The court that surrounded Elizabeth glittered with intelligence and artistry, attracting scholars, poets, musicians, and natural philosophers who saw in England opportunities unavailable in more rigidly controlled continental realms. Sir Francis Bacon laid the foundations of experimental science, while Richard Hooker crafted theological justifications for the Elizabethan religious settlement that satisfied both reformed conscience and traditional sensibility. The Queen herself, fluent in Latin, Greek, French, and Italian, participated in this intellectual flowering as both patron and practitioner, her translations of classical authors demonstrating the humanist education that shaped her worldview. As Elizabeth aged without providing the heir that Parliament had begged her to secure, the question of succession began to cast longer shadows across the golden afternoon of her reign. James VI of Scotland, son of the executed Mary, emerged as the likely inheritor of England's crown, his Protestant upbringing and Tudor bloodline through his mother, making him acceptable to most of Elizabeth's subjects despite his foreign birth. James I. From the northern kingdom, where John Knox's stern Calvinism had taken root among granite hills and Presbyterian consciences, James Stuart journeyed south in the spring of 1603 to claim the English crown that Elizabeth's death had finally made available. The king, who would unite Scotland and England under a single sovereignty, brought with him not only the legitimacy of Tudor descent through his mother Mary Queen of Scots, but also the peculiar challenges of ruling two realms whose histories had been written more often in mutual hostility than cooperative alliance. James's vision of unified British monarchy faced immediate resistance from English parliaments, accustomed to their realm's primacy in the island's affairs. The king's dream of legislative union, of a single parliament governing both kingdoms under the name of Great Britain, founded on prejudices as ancient as border warfare and as practical as competing legal systems. English lawyers worried that Scottish customs might contaminate their common law traditions, while merchants feared that expanded trade might diminish their privileged positions in established markets. The theological disputes that marked James's early English years reflected the complex religious inheritance that Elizabeth had bequeathed to her successor. At the Hampton Court Conference of 1604, where Puritan ministers presented their grievances against episcopal authority while Anglican bishops defended traditional church government, the king demonstrated the learning that had earned him reputation as the most scholarly monarch in Europe. James's compromise preserved episcopal structure while authorizing the new translation of Scripture that would become his reign's most enduring monument. The King James Bible, completed in 1611 through the collaborative efforts of the finest Hebrew and Greek scholars in England, achieved a literary perfection that transcended its theological purposes. In parish churches and private chambers, in great cathedrals and humble meeting houses, the cadences of this new translation would shape English religious consciousness for centuries, its phrases entering common speech with such naturalness that later generations would forget their scriptural origins. Yet even as James's reign produced theological harmony, political tensions began to accumulate like storm clouds on distant horizons. The king's theory of divine right, that conviction that monarchs answered to God alone rather than to earthly parliaments, clashed with English traditions of consultation and consent that stretched back through centuries of custom and precedent. In speeches that combined scholarly precision with royal hauteur, James lectured his subjects on the absolute nature of kingly authority, while Parliament listened with the polite attention that concealed growing skepticism. The Gunpowder Plot of 1605 demonstrated both the persistent Catholic threat to James's Protestant realm and the effectiveness of government intelligence in protecting royal authority. Guy Fawkes and his fellow conspirators, driven by the desperate hope that spectacular violence might somehow restore Catholic fortunes, found their careful plans unraveled by informants and intercepted letters. The discovery of gunpowder barrels beneath Parliament's chambers provided Protestant England with a new mythology of deliverance, while the brutal executions that followed reminded potential rebels that treason still carried ancient penalties. James's foreign policy reflected his preference for diplomatic solutions over military adventures, a peaceable inclination that frustrated those who remembered Elizabeth's triumphant defiance of Spanish power. The king, who titled himself Rex Pacificus, sought to balance England's Protestant identity against the practical necessities of European politics, negotiating marriages and treaties that would secure his realm's interests without precipitating the costly wars that had drained his predecessor's treasury. The marriage negotiations that brought the Spanish Infanta's dowry within reach of English royal finances collapsed amid parliamentary opposition and popular prejudice against Catholic alliance. When Prince Charles and the Duke of Buckingham returned from Madrid without bride or treaty, London's streets erupted in celebrations that revealed how deeply anti-Spanish sentiment had penetrated English consciousness during decades of intermittent conflict. Colonial ventures in Virginia and Massachusetts began during James's reign to establish the overseas plantations that would eventually transform England from a European kingdom into the center of global empire. The Virginia Company's settlements along America's eastern coast, sustained by tobacco cultivation and indentured labor, provided both economic opportunity and colonial experience that would prove invaluable in later imperial expansion. Meanwhile, the Mayflower's passengers, those separatist Puritans who found James's religious compromises inadequate for their stricter consciences, carried English civilization across the Atlantic while seeking the pure Reformed churches they could not establish in their homeland. The king's efforts to manage Scotland and England as coordinate realms revealed both the possibilities and limitations of personal monarchy in an age of expanding governmental complexity. James maintained his Scottish court while establishing royal authority in England, but the practical difficulties of governing two kingdoms with distinct legal systems, religious establishments, and political traditions proved more challenging than his theoretical vision of unified British monarchy had anticipated. Parliament's growing assertiveness during James's later years reflected not only constitutional principles, but also the practical frustrations of governing with insufficient revenue. The king's generosity to Scottish favourites, his expensive taste for court ceremony, and his reluctance to summon Parliament except when financial necessity demanded, it created a cycle of mutual suspicion that would plague his son's inheritance. In committee rooms where English gentlemen calculated the costs of royal government, resentment grew against a monarch who seemed to prefer the company of handsome young men to the counsel of seasoned legislators. Charles I. In the shadow of his father's learning and his elder brother's promise, Charles Stuart had grown to manhood as the unlikely heir to a throne that divine providence had reserved for him through death's intervention. The prince who became Charles I in 1625 possessed neither James's intellectual gifts nor Henry's charismatic presence, but rather a refined aesthetic sensibility and an unshakable conviction in royal prerogative that would prove both his greatest strength and his ultimate undoing. The personal rule that Charles established after dismissing Parliament in 1629 represented his attempt to govern England according to principles of harmony and order that reflected his deepest beliefs about monarchical authority. For 11 years, the king ruled without calling Parliament, financing his government through ingenious interpretation of ancient prerogatives and forgotten legal precedents. Ship money, that medieval levy originally imposed on coastal counties for naval defense, expanded under Charles's direction to encompass inland shires whose residents had never seen salt water, much less enemy fleets threatening their shores. Charles's court became a showcase for the artistic sophistication that marked his reign's cultural achievements. Van Dyck's portraits captured the languid elegance of Caroline nobility with painterly skill that rivaled the great masters of continental Europe, while Inigo Jones designed architectural fantasies that brought Italian Renaissance principles to English building projects. The masks performed at Whitehall Palace, those elaborate allegorical entertainments where courtiers danced in costume while professional musicians provided accompaniment, created a world of refined beauty that seemed to exist independent of the political tensions gathering beyond palace walls. The religious policies that Charles pursued under Archbishop Laud's guidance reflected the king's preference for ceremonial dignity over Puritan simplicity. In parish churches across England, altars returned to their traditional positions while communion rails restored the physical separation between sacred and secular space that Protestant reformers had sought to eliminate. Laud's vision of Anglican worship emphasized beauty and reverence, the kind of ordered ceremonial that spoke to Charles's aesthetic sensibilities while alarming Puritan consciences already suspicious of popish tendencies in church government. Scotland's violent rejection of the prayer book that Charles attempted to impose on his northern kingdom in 1637 shattered the peaceful isolation that personal rule had maintained. In Edinburgh's St. Giles Cathedral, where Jenny Geddes allegedly threw her stool at the dean who dared read from Lord's liturgy, Scottish resistance crystallised into the national covenant that bound Presbyterian Scotland to resist religious innovations. The bishops' wars that followed demonstrated both the limitations of English military power and the strength of Scottish determination to preserve their religious independence. Financial necessity finally forced Charles to recall the parliament he had dismissed so confidently 11 years earlier, but the short parliament of 1640 proved no more tractable than its predecessors. When the king dissolved this assembly after 3 weeks of fruitless negotiation, England found itself caught between Scottish military pressure and constitutional deadlock. The Long Parliament that assembled in November 1640 came armed with grievances, accumulated during 11 years of personal rule and determination to reshape the balance between royal prerogative and parliamentary authority. The execution of Strafford in 1641 marked Charles's first great defeat in the constitutional struggle that would define his reign's final decade. Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Strafford, had served as the king's most effective administrator in Ireland, but his policy of thorough had earned him enemies who saw in his efficient authoritarianism a preview of the absolutism that Charles might impose on England itself. When Parliament demanded Strafford's life, the king's reluctant consent to the Bill of Attainder revealed the erosion of royal authority under pressure from popular demonstrations and parliamentary insistence. The Irish rebellion that erupted in October 1641 provided the spark that ignited England's constitutional crisis into civil war. Reports of Protestant massacres, many exaggerated or fabricated, inflamed English opinion, while creating the military emergency that both king and parliament sought to control. Charles's attempt to arrest 5 members of parliament in January 1642 represented his final effort to assert royal authority through dramatic gesture, but when he entered the House of Commons only to find the birds had flown, the failure of his coup demonstrated how completely the initiative had passed to his opponents. The civil war that began with the king's raising of his standard at Nottingham in August 1642 divided England along lines that reflected not only constitutional principles but also regional loyalties, religious convictions, and social tensions that had been building for decades. In market towns where neighbours discovered they stood on opposite sides of issues they had never imagined might require such choices, families split between king and parliament, while ancient certainties crumbled like autumn leaves in English winds. Charles's military strategy reflected his belief that royal authority required only the defeat of rebellious subjects rather than their conversion to royalist principles. The king's armies, led by his dashing nephew Prince Rupert, won spectacular victories at Edgehill and elsewhere, but these triumphs could not overcome the fundamental reality that Parliament controlled London, the Navy, and England's commercial wealth. As the war dragged on through seasons of marching and counter-marching, of sieges endured and battles fought in English fields that had never known such violence, the king found his support eroding among subjects who had initially rallied to legitimate authority. The alliance with Scotland that finally tipped the military balance against Charles demonstrated how far the constitutional struggle had moved beyond its English origins. When Scottish armies crossed the border to fight beside Parliament's forces, the king faced not merely rebellious subjects but the combined opposition of both his kingdoms. The decisive defeat at Naseby in 1645 left Charles with few options beyond negotiation or flight, but his continued belief in the sacred nature of kingship made meaningful compromise impossible. In the quiet chambers of Hampton Court, where Charles spent months under parliamentary guard while negotiating with various factions, the king's faith in his divine appointment remained unshaken, even as his temporal power crumbled. His secret correspondence with foreign allies and attempts to escape custody revealed a monarch who could not accept the limitations that Parliament sought to impose on royal prerogative. When Charles finally fled to the Isle of Wight, only to find himself a prisoner of the governor he had trusted, the last hope of negotiated settlement died with his freedom. The trial that brought Charles before Westminster Hall in January 1649 created a legal and constitutional precedent that shocked not only royalist England but monarchical Europe. The court that condemned the king to death acted in the name of popular sovereignty, claiming authority that transcended traditional notions of divine right and hereditary succession. When Charles refused to recognize the court's jurisdiction, insisting that no earthly tribunal could judge God's anointed, he maintained his principles even as the scaffold awaited. On a cold January morning, in 1649, King Charles I walked through Whitehall's banqueting house, beneath the ceiling where Rubens had painted the apotheosis of his father, to meet the death that would transform him from failed monarch into royal martyr. His final words from the scaffold, spoken to the hushed crowd that gathered to witness this unprecedented spectacle, maintained his conviction that he died not as a tyrant, but as a defender of ancient law and rightful authority against the innovations of rebellious subjects. The Commonwealth, kingless experiment. In the winter of 1649, something unprecedented settled over England like morning mist. For the first time in nearly 6 centuries, no crown sat upon any head, no royal seal pressed into warm wax, no courtiers bowed in gilded halls. The Commonwealth had begun, that curious decade when England tried to govern itself without a king. Oliver Cromwell, the Huntingdon farmer turned general, found himself at the helm of this kingless experiment. His new model army had proven itself in battle. Disciplined soldiers who sang psalms before charging, who carried Bibles alongside their swords. These were not the rough mercenaries of earlier wars, but earnest men convinced they fought for divine purpose. Their red coats became a familiar sight on muddy English roads, their measured steps echoing in market squares where once only merchants' voices had carried. The machinery of government had to be rebuilt from scratch. Where royal proclamations once emanated from Whitehall, now the Rump Parliament, that stubborn remnant of the Long Parliament, debated endlessly in Westminster's chambers. The very chairs seemed to echo with uncertainty. How does one govern without the ancient weight of royal tradition? How does authority flow when it springs not from blood and birthright, but from the uncertain mandate of surviving parliamentarians? Cromwell himself wrestled with these questions in the quiet hours before dawn. He would rise early, as farmers do, and walk the gardens of his modest quarters, perhaps wondering if God truly intended England to chart this unprecedented course. The irony was not lost on him that a man who had helped execute a king now found himself wielding power that kings had only dreamed of. The Commonwealth's domestic policies carried the scent of Puritan conviction. Theatres fell silent, their stages gathering dust where Shakespeare's comedies had once delighted audiences. Christmas celebrations were discouraged, too much revelry, too much popish tradition. Instead, England was to become a godly nation, sober and industrious. Sunday became a day of strict observance, when even cooking was frowned upon. The very air seemed to grow more serious. Yet for all its moral severity, the Commonwealth proved remarkably effective at trade and navigation. The Navigation Acts of 1651 decreed that English goods must travel in English ships, manned by English sailors. This was economic nationalism, wrapped in practical legislation, designed to challenge Dutch dominance of the seas. In harbours from Hull to Plymouth, shipwrights hammered and sawed with new purpose. English oak was transformed into vessels that would carry English wool to foreign ports, returning laden with spices and silk. The Commonwealth's navy grew formidable under Cromwell's watchful eye. Admiral Robert Blake, a quiet Somerset man who came to seamanship late in life, led English fleets to victories that surprised even their enemies. Dutch admirals who had grown comfortable with their maritime supremacy found themselves outmaneuvered by these upstart English republicans. The sound of cannon fire echoed across the North Sea as old certainties crumbled. But perhaps the most telling aspect of the Commonwealth was how desperately it craved the very stability it had destroyed. Without royal ceremonies to mark the seasons, without ancient rituals to lend meaning to state occasions, England felt strangely hollow. Cromwell found himself accepting titles and honours that edged ever closer to kingship. Lord Protector, they called him, and his court began to resemble what it had replaced. The great halls of Whitehall, once filled with Charles I art collection, now hosted more modest gatherings. Yet even these carried a formality that spoke to deep human needs for ceremony and hierarchy. The Commonwealth discovered what revolutionaries often learn too late, that tradition serves purposes beyond mere ornament. By the late 1650s, a quiet exhaustion had settled over the land. The moral fervour that had carried the revolution forward had given way to a longing for familiar rhythms. When Cromwell died in 1658, during a great storm that seemed to mirror the nation's turbulent state, even his most devoted followers sensed that something was ending. His son Richard, gentle and scholarly, proved unequal to the task of holding together his father's creation. The army commanders, those stern men who had once seemed so certain of their cause, began to quarrel among themselves. In taverns and coffeehouses, voices that had been whispered now spoke more boldly of restoration, of bringing back the ancient ways. The Commonwealth's final months carried the melancholy of inevitability. General George Monk, that pragmatic Scotsman who commanded the army in the north, began his careful march toward London in the winter of 1659. His soldiers' footsteps on frozen roads marked the rhythm of approaching change. England's kingless experiment, that bold attempt to govern through virtue and parliamentary debate, was drawing to its quiet close. In the end, the Commonwealth taught England something precious about itself, that it was a nation shaped by centuries of royal tradition, that its rhythms were tuned to older music than Republican theory could provide. The experiment had not failed, exactly, but it had revealed the deep currents that run beneath the surface of any nation's life. Soon, across the Channel, a young man would be preparing for his return, and England would discover what it truly meant to welcome back a king. The Commonwealth, kingless experiment. In the winter of 1649, something unprecedented settled over England like morning mist. For the first time in nearly 6 centuries, no crown sat upon any head, no royal seal pressed into warm wax, no courtiers bowed in gilded halls. The Commonwealth had begun, that curious decade when England tried to govern itself without a king. Oliver Cromwell, the Huntingdon farmer turned general, found himself at the helm of this kingless experiment. His new model army had proven itself in battle, disciplined soldiers who sang psalms before charging, who carried Bibles alongside their swords. These were not the rough mercenaries of earlier wars, but earnest men convinced they fought for divine purpose. Their red coats became a familiar sight on muddy English roads, their measured steps echoing in market squares where once only merchants' voices had carried. The machinery of government had to be rebuilt from scratch. Where royal proclamations once emanated from Whitehall, now the Rump Parliament, that stubborn remnant of the Long Parliament, debated endlessly in Westminster's chambers. The very chairs seemed to echo with uncertainty. How does one govern without the ancient weight of royal tradition? How does authority flow when it springs not from blood and birthright, but from the uncertain mandate of surviving parliamentarians? Cromwell himself wrestled with these questions in the quiet hours before dawn. He would rise early, as farmers do, and walk the gardens of his modest quarters, perhaps wondering if God truly intended England to chart this unprecedented course. The irony was not lost on him that a man who had helped execute a king now found himself wielding power that kings had only dreamed of. The Commonwealth's domestic policies carried the scent of Puritan conviction. Theatres fell silent, their stages gathering dust where Shakespeare's comedies had once delighted audiences. Christmas celebrations were discouraged, too much revelry, too much popish tradition. Instead, England was to become a godly nation, sober and industrious. Sunday became a day of strict observance, when even cooking was frowned upon. The very air seemed to grow more serious. Yet for all its moral severity, the Commonwealth proved remarkably effective at trade and navigation. The Navigation Acts of 1651 decreed that English goods must travel in English ships, manned by English sailors. This was economic nationalism wrapped in practical legislation, designed to challenge Dutch dominance of the seas. In harbours from Hull to Plymouth, shipwrights hammered and sawed with new purpose. English oak was transformed into vessels that would carry English wool to foreign ports, returning laden with spices and silk. The Commonwealth's navy grew formidable under Cromwell's watchful eye. Admiral Robert Blake, a quiet Somerset man who came to seamanship late in life, led English fleets to victories that surprised even their enemies. Dutch admirals who had grown comfortable with their maritime supremacy found themselves outmaneuvered by these upstart English republicans. The sound of cannon fire echoed across the North Sea as old certainties crumbled. But perhaps the most telling aspect of the Commonwealth was how desperately it craved the very stability it had destroyed. Without royal ceremonies to mark the seasons, without ancient rituals to lend meaning to state occasions, England felt strangely hollow. Cromwell found himself accepting titles and honours that edged ever closer to kingship. Lord Protector, they called him, and his court began to resemble what it had replaced. The great halls of Whitehall, once filled with Charles I art collection, now hosted more modest gatherings, yet even these carried a formality that spoke to deep human needs for ceremony and hierarchy. The Commonwealth discovered what revolutionaries often learn too late: that tradition serves purposes beyond mere ornament. By the late 1650s, a quiet exhaustion had settled over the land. The moral fervour that had carried the revolution forward had given way to a longing for familiar rhythms. When Cromwell died in 1658, during a great storm that seemed to mirror the nation's turbulent state, even his most devoted followers sensed that something was ending. His son Richard, gentle and scholarly, proved unequal to the task of holding together his father's creation. The army commanders, those stern men who had once seemed so certain of their cause, began to quarrel among themselves. In taverns and coffee-houses, voices that had been whispered now spoke more boldly of restoration, of bringing back the ancient ways. The Commonwealth's final months carried the melancholy of inevitability. General George Monk, that pragmatic Scotsman who commanded the army in the north, began his careful march toward London in the winter of 1659. His soldiers' footsteps on frozen roads marked the rhythm of approaching change. England's kingless experiment, that bold attempt to govern through virtue and parliamentary debate, was drawing to its quiet close. In the end, the Commonwealth taught England something precious about itself: that it was a nation shaped by centuries of royal tradition, that its rhythms were tuned to older music than Republican theory could provide. The experiment had not failed, exactly, but it had revealed the deep currents that run beneath the surface of any nation's life. Soon, across the Channel, a young man would be preparing for his return, and England would discover what it truly meant to welcome back a king. Charles II, the Merry Restorer. May 29th, 1660, dawned bright over London, and the city stirred with an excitement it had almost forgotten how to feel. Church bells that had been silent for years began to peal from every steeple, their bronze voices carrying news that seemed almost too wonderful to believe: the king was coming home. Charles Stuart, second of that name, would enter his capital that day not as a conqueror, but as a restoration of England's deepest self. The 30-year-old monarch, who rode through the flower-strewn streets, bore little resemblance to the 19-year-old prince who had fled after Worcester's defeat. 11 years of exile had polished him like a stone tumbled by river currents. At the court of his cousin Louis XIV, he had learned the arts of diplomacy and dissimulation, had watched how absolute monarchy worked when wielded with intelligence and charm. The French courtiers had found him agreeable company, witty, sophisticated, possessed of that particular brand of Stuart magnetism that drew people like moths to candlelight. But Charles returned to an England that had grown skeptical of grand gestures and divine proclamations. The Puritan years had created a nation that valued substance over ceremony, results over rhetoric. The new king understood this instinctively. Where his father had insisted on royal prerogatives like a man defending a fortress, Charles II approached kingship like a skilled diplomat negotiating a complex treaty. He would be restored to his throne, yes, but he would earn his keep. The early signs were promising. Within months of his return, The theatres reopened with a burst of creative energy that seemed to compensate for their decade of silence. The King's Company and the Duke's Company competed to stage the most spectacular productions, their candlelit stages alive with wit and music. For the first time, women appeared as actresses rather than boys, in feminine dress, lending a new naturalism to performances that delighted audiences. Charles himself could often be found in the royal box, applauding enthusiastically, his presence lending glamour to an art form that had been condemned as sinful just years before. The king's own romantic life provided almost as much entertainment as the stage. Nell Gwyn, the orange seller-turned-actress, captured not just his heart but the nation's affection with her quick wit and unpretentious charm. When hostile crowds mistook her coach for that of his Catholic mistress, she reportedly stuck her head out and called, "Pray, good people, be civil, I am the Protestant whore." Such irreverence would have horrified Charles I, but his son understood that a monarchy secure in its people's affections could afford to laugh at itself. Yet beneath the restored gaiety, serious business demanded attention. The Royal Society, chartered in 1660, represented a new approach to learning that Charles embraced with genuine enthusiasm. In candlelit rooms at Gresham College, gentlemen gathered to conduct experiments, to peer through microscopes at previously invisible worlds, to discuss the mechanical principles that might govern everything from planetary motion to blood circulation. The king himself dabbled in chemistry, maintaining a laboratory at Whitehall where he conducted experiments that sometimes alarmed his courtiers with their explosive potential. Christopher Wren, that quiet mathematician turned architect, found in Charles a patron who understood that a restored monarchy needed physical symbols of its renewed confidence. When the Great Fire of 1666 swept through London's medieval heart, consuming 13,000 houses and 89 churches in 4 terrible days, it created an opportunity as well as a catastrophe. The king walked through the still smoking ruins with Wren, their footsteps crunching on ash and debris, planning a new city that would rise from the old like a phoenix. The new St. Paul's Cathedral that gradually took shape under Wren's direction embodied the spirit of Restoration England, classical in inspiration but unmistakably English in execution, grand enough to impress visiting dignitaries, but human enough in scale to welcome ordinary worshippers. Charles would sometimes climb the scaffolding to inspect the work, his presence encouraging the stonemasons and carpenters whose labor was creating a monument to national renewal. The plague that preceded the fire had tested the kingdom's resilience in different ways. When disease stalked through London's crowded streets in 1665, claiming perhaps 100,000 lives, Charles and his court retreated to Oxford, leaving the capital to face its ordeal largely alone. Yet the king's absence, which might have seemed like abandonment, was probably wise. Royal deaths from plague would have created succession crises at the worst possible moment. Instead, Charles returned to a chastened but surviving city, ready to rebuild both physically and spiritually. Foreign policy required the same delicate balance between ambition and pragmatism that characterized his domestic rule. The Dutch wars that punctuated his reign reflected England's growing confidence as a maritime power, but they were fought with limited objectives and realistic expectations. When Dutch ships sailed up the Medway in 1667, capturing or burning English vessels within sight of London, Charles absorbed the humiliation with apparent equanimity. Better a temporary embarrassment than a ruinous conflict that might threaten the stability he had worked so hard to establish. His secret negotiations with Louis XIV, sealed in the Treaty of Dover, revealed the complexity of his position. Publicly Protestant, privately perhaps inclined toward Catholicism, Charles walked a theological tightrope that would have challenged a saint. The subsidies he received from France in exchange for his promises of religious tolerance and military cooperation provided financial independence from Parliament while potentially compromising his kingdom's interests. It was statecraft of the most sophisticated kind, morally ambiguous, strategically calculated, personally risky. The popish plot that erupted in 1678 tested both his political skills and his personal courage. Titus Oates, that unsavory fabricator of conspiracy theories, claimed to have uncovered Catholic plans to assassinate the king and restore papal authority. The resulting hysteria saw innocent men executed on perjured testimony, while Charles himself walked a careful line between protecting his Catholic subjects and maintaining his Protestant credentials. His refusal to exclude his Catholic brother James from the succession showed both loyalty and political realism, better a problematic heir than civil war. As his reign drew toward its close, Charles II could survey an achievement that seemed modest only because it had been accomplished with such apparent ease. He had restored not just monarchy but the idea of monarchy, had shown that traditional institutions could adapt to changing circumstances without losing their essential character. The coffee houses where gentlemen debated politics, the scientific societies where new knowledge was pursued, the theatres where human nature was explored with unprecedented honesty, all flourished under a crown that knew when to guide and when to let alone. When he died in February 1685, having apologized to his courtiers for being an unconscionable time dying, Charles left behind a kingdom that was prosperous, stable, and confident. The merry monarch had proven that restoration need not mean reaction, that tradition and innovation could dance together like partners in one of his beloved court masques. His greatest achievement was perhaps the simplest. He had made England comfortable with itself again, had shown that a nation could acknowledge its past mistakes without being paralyzed by them. Charles II, the Merry Restorer. May 29th, 1660, dawned bright over London, and the city stirred with an excitement it had almost forgotten how to feel. Church bells that had been silent for years began to peal from every steeple, their bronze voices carrying news that seemed almost too wonderful to believe. The king was coming home. Charles Stuart, second of that name, would enter his capital that day not as a conqueror, but as a restoration of England's deepest self. The 30-year-old monarch, who rode through the flower-strewn streets, bore little resemblance to the 19-year-old prince who had fled after Worcester's defeat. 11 years of exile had polished him like a stone tumbled by river currents. At the court of his cousin Louis XIV, he had learned the arts of diplomacy and dissimulation, had watched how absolute monarchy worked when wielded with intelligence and charm. The French courtiers had found him agreeable company, witty, sophisticated, possessed of that particular brand of Stuart magnetism that drew people like moths to candlelight. But Charles returned to an England that had grown skeptical of grand gestures and divine proclamations. The Puritan years had created a nation that valued substance over ceremony, results over rhetoric. The new king understood this instinctively. Where his father had insisted on royal prerogatives like a man defending a fortress, Charles II approached kingship like a skilled diplomat negotiating a complex treaty. He would be restored to his throne, yes, but he would earn his keep. The early signs were promising. Within months of his return, the theatres reopened with a burst of creative energy that seemed to compensate for their decade of silence. The King's Company and the Duke's Company competed to stage the most spectacular productions, their candlelit stages alive with wit and music. For the first time, women appeared as actresses rather than boys, in feminine dress, lending a new naturalism to performances that delighted audiences. Charles himself could often be found in the royal box, applauding enthusiastically, his presence lending glamour to an art form that had been condemned as sinful just years before. The king's own romantic life provided almost as much entertainment as the stage. Nell Gwynn, the orange seller-turned actress, captured not just his heart but the nation's affection with her quick wit and unpretentious charm. When hostile crowds mistook her coach for that of his Catholic mistress, she reportedly stuck her head out and called, "Pray, good people, be civil, I am the Protestant whore." Such irreverence would have horrified Charles I, but his son understood that a monarchy secure in its people's affections could afford to laugh at itself. Yet beneath the restored gaiety, serious business demanded attention. The Royal Society, chartered in 1660, represented a new approach to learning that Charles embraced with genuine enthusiasm. In candlelit rooms at Gresham College, gentlemen gathered to conduct experiments, to peer through microscopes at previously invisible worlds, to discuss the mechanical principles that might govern everything from planetary motion to blood circulation. The king himself dabbled in chemistry, maintaining a laboratory at Whitehall where he conducted experiments that sometimes alarmed his courtiers with their explosive potential. Christopher Wren, that quiet mathematician turned architect, found in Charles a patron who understood that a restored monarchy needed physical symbols of its renewed confidence. When the Great Fire of 1666 swept through London's medieval heart, consuming 13,000 houses and 89 churches in 4 terrible days, it created an opportunity as well as a catastrophe. The king walked through the still smoking ruins with Wren, their footsteps crunching on ash and debris, planning a new city that would rise from the old like a phoenix. The new St. Paul's Cathedral that gradually took shape under Wren's direction embodied the spirit of Restoration England, classical in inspiration but unmistakably English in execution, grand enough to impress visiting dignitaries, but human enough in scale to welcome ordinary worshippers. Charles would sometimes climb the scaffolding to inspect the work, his presence encouraging the stonemasons and carpenters whose labor was creating a monument to national renewal. The plague that preceded the fire had tested the kingdom's resilience in different ways. When disease stalked through London's crowded streets in 1665, claiming perhaps 100,000 lives, Charles and his court retreated to Oxford, leaving the capital to face its ordeal largely alone. Yet the king's absence, which might have seemed like abandonment, was probably wise. Royal deaths from plague would have created succession crises at the worst possible moment. Instead, Charles returned to a chastened but surviving city, ready to rebuild both physically and spiritually. Foreign policy required the same delicate balance between ambition and pragmatism that characterized his domestic rule. The Dutch wars that punctuated his reign reflected England's growing confidence as a maritime power, but they were fought with limited objectives and realistic expectations. When Dutch ships sailed up the Medway in 1667, capturing or burning English vessels within sight of London, Charles absorbed the humiliation with apparent equanimity. Better a temporary embarrassment than a ruinous conflict that might threaten the stability he had worked so hard to establish. His secret negotiations with Louis XIV, sealed in the Treaty of Dover, revealed the complexity of his position. Publicly Protestant, privately perhaps inclined toward Catholicism, Charles walked a theological tightrope that would have challenged a saint. The subsidies he received from France in exchange for his promises of religious tolerance and military cooperation provided financial independence from Parliament while potentially compromising his kingdom's interests. It was statecraft of the most sophisticated kind, morally ambiguous, strategically calculated, personally risky. The popish plot that erupted in 1678 tested both his political skills and his personal courage. Titus Oates, that unsavory fabricator of conspiracy theories, claimed to have uncovered Catholic plans to assassinate the king and restore papal authority. The resulting hysteria saw innocent men executed on perjured testimony, while Charles himself walked a careful line between protecting his Catholic subjects and maintaining his Protestant credentials. His refusal to exclude his Catholic brother James from the succession showed both loyalty and political realism, better a problematic heir than civil war. As his reign drew toward its close, Charles II could survey an achievement that seemed modest only because it had been accomplished with such apparent ease. He had restored not just monarchy but the idea of monarchy, had shown that traditional institutions could adapt to changing circumstances without losing their essential character. The coffee houses where gentlemen debated politics, the scientific societies where new knowledge was pursued, the theatres where human nature was explored with unprecedented honesty, all flourished under a crown that knew when to guide and when to let alone. When he died in February 1685, having apologized to his courtiers for being an unconscionable time dying, Charles left behind a kingdom that was prosperous, stable, and confident. The merry monarch had proven that restoration need not mean reaction, that tradition and innovation could dance together like partners in one of his beloved court masks. His greatest achievement was perhaps the simplest. He had made England comfortable with itself again, had shown that a nation could acknowledge its past mistakes without being paralyzed by them. William III. Mary II, glorious settlement. The ships that appeared off Torbay on November 5, 1688, carried more than an invasion force. They bore the blueprint for a constitutional revolution that would reshape the English-speaking world. William of Orange, that slight asthmatic Dutchman with the steady grey eyes, had crossed the Channel not merely to claim a crown but to forge a new understanding of what monarchy meant in a modern state. Beside him, in spirit if not in person, stood his wife Mary, whose Stuart blood legitimized their joint claim to the throne her father had abandoned. The Glorious Revolution, as posterity would name it, proceeded with remarkable restraint. Where previous English upheavals had seen battlefields strewn with corpses and scaffold platforms slick with blood, this transfer of power unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. James II's flight to France removed the need for a decisive military confrontation, but it left constitutional lawyers wrestling with an unprecedented situation. Had the king abdicated? Had he been deposed? The answers mattered because they would determine the legal foundation for whatever followed. Parliament, recalled after James's departure, resolved the dilemma with characteristic English pragmatism. Rather than delving too deeply into theoretical niceties, they simply declared the throne vacant and offered it jointly to William and Mary. The arrangement satisfied multiple constituencies. Mary's hereditary claim pleased legitimists, while William's proven Protestant credentials reassured religious conservatives. More importantly, the joint sovereignty established a precedent for parliamentary involvement in royal succession that would echo through subsequent centuries. The Bill of Rights, passed in December 1689, codified the Revolution's achievements in language that balanced ancient liberties with practical necessities. Kings could no longer suspend laws without parliamentary consent, maintain standing armies in peacetime, or interfere with parliamentary elections. The Crown's judicial powers were curtailed, while subjects gained explicit rights to petition their sovereign and bear arms for their defence. These provisions might seem modest by later standards, but they represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between ruler and ruled. William and Mary's court at Kensington Palace reflected their joint reign's unique character. The king, never comfortable with ceremonial grandeur, preferred working sessions to formal audiences. His study, lined with maps of European battlefields and diplomatic correspondence, resembled a military headquarters more than a royal chamber. Mary, more naturally sociable, presided over drawing rooms where politics and culture mingled in ways that would have seemed scandalous to earlier generations. The informality was deliberate. These monarchs ruled by consent rather than divine appointment, and their accessibility emphasized the contractual nature of their authority. The Bank of England, established in 1694, represented perhaps the most significant innovation of their reign. William's continental wars required financing on a scale that traditional royal revenues could never support. The solution, a national bank that would lend to the government while managing the kingdom's currency and credit, created the financial infrastructure that would underpin Britain's subsequent rise to global prominence. Merchants and landowners who subscribed to the bank's initial capital literally bought into the revolution's success, their investments creating stakeholders in the new constitutional order. Religious settlement proved more complex than constitutional arrangements. The Toleration Act of 1689 granted freedom of worship to Protestant dissenters while maintaining the Church of England's established position. Catholics remained excluded from full political participation, but the savage persecutions of earlier eras gave way to grudging acceptance. William, whose Dutch Reformed background made him sympathetic to religious minorities, understood that stability required compromise rather than uniformity. The Jacobite threat that emerged after James II's exile in France added urgency to the new regime's consolidation efforts. In the Scottish Highlands, clan chiefs who had sworn loyalty to the Stuart dynasty faced agonizing choices between ancient obligations and political realities. The massacre of Glencoe in 1692, where government forces slaughtered MacDonalds who had delayed submitting to William's authority, stained the new reign with blood that Highland memories would preserve for generations. Mary's death from smallpox in December 1694 devastated William both personally and politically. The king, never demonstrative in public, reportedly wept openly at her bedside, his grief visible to courtiers who had rarely seen him display emotion. Politically, her passing left him ruling alone in a kingdom where his foreign birth and Protestant zeal had won respect rather than affection. The joint sovereignty that had legitimized his rule now rested solely on parliamentary support and military success. William's remaining years were dominated by the struggle against Louis XIV's France, that great contest for European hegemony that would consume English resources and attention for the next 2 decades. The king proved to be a competent rather than brilliant general, winning few spectacular victories but maintaining the coalitions necessary to contain French expansion. His true genius lay in diplomacy, the patient work of balancing competing interests, managing fractious allies, and maintaining the financial credit that kept armies in the field. The War of the Spanish Succession, which erupted shortly before William's death, demonstrated how completely England had abandoned its former isolation. English regiments marched with Austrian and Dutch allies across European battlefields, while English ships patrolled Mediterranean waters alongside Portuguese and Savoyard vessels. The kingdom that had once viewed continental politics with indifference now found itself at the center of European affairs, its constitutional revolution having transformed it into a great power. Domestic politics during William's later years reflected the constitutional settlement's growing maturity. The emergence of recognizable political parties, Whigs and Tories with distinct platforms and organized leadership, represented a new form of political competition that operated within accepted constitutional bounds. Ministers now required parliamentary as well as royal confidence, while opposition politicians could criticize government policy without facing charges of treason. The press, freed from the licensing requirements that had previously constrained it, became a forum for political debate that would have been unimaginable under earlier monarchs. Coffee houses from London to Edinburgh buzzed with discussions of government policy, foreign intelligence, and commercial intelligence. A public sphere was emerging where subjects could debate their rulers' decisions and hold them accountable through electoral pressure. William's death in March 1702, following a riding accident at Hampton Court, marked the end of an extraordinary partnership that had reshaped English governance. The revolution they had overseen was indeed glorious, not because it had been bloodless, but because it had established principles that would guide political development for centuries to come. Parliamentary sovereignty, religious toleration, constitutional monarchy, financial responsibility, these concepts that seem natural to modern democracies, were revolutionary innovations in the 1690s. Their legacy extended far beyond England's shores. The constitutional settlement they established would influence political development throughout the English-speaking world, providing models for American colonists, Canadian Confederation builders, and countless other societies seeking to balance effective government with individual liberty. The Bank of England's success would inspire central banks worldwide, while the religious compromises they negotiated would inform discussions of church-state relations for generations. Most fundamentally, William and Mary had demonstrated that monarchy could evolve without disappearing, that ancient institutions could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining their essential functions. They had shown that revolution need not mean destruction, that constitutional change could proceed through legal channels rather than violent upheaval. In doing so, they had pointed toward a future where political conflict could be resolved through debate rather than warfare, where subjects could become citizens without ceasing to be loyal to the crown. The candlelit rooms of Kensington Palace, where they had planned this transformation, had witnessed the birth of modern constitutional government. Their joint reign, brief though it was, had created institutions and precedents that would outlast empires, providing the foundation for political systems that millions of people would eventually call home. Anne, Union, Succession Woes. Queen Anne ascended the throne in March 1702 with the peculiar distinction of being simultaneously the most personally tragic and politically successful monarch of her era. At 37, she had already buried 17 children, some stillborn, others claimed by the cruel mathematics of infant mortality that stalked even royal nurseries. Yet this woman, whose private life had been shadowed by almost biblical suffering, would preside over military triumphs that established Britain as Europe's dominant power and constitutional developments that secured parliamentary government for posterity. The new queen's physical presence commanded both sympathy and respect. Gout had made walking painful, often confining her to wheeled chairs that servants pushed through the corridors of St. James's Palace. Yet, her mind remained sharp, her political instincts surprisingly astute for someone who had spent most of her adult life focused on dynastic rather than governmental concerns. Anne understood instinctively what many more sophisticated politicians missed, that successful rule required not just constitutional authority but personal connection with subjects who needed to believe their sovereign cared about their welfare. The War of the Spanish Succession, which had begun during William III's final months, dominated Anne's early reign like a thundercloud that promised either glorious sunshine or devastating storms. The conflict's stakes could hardly have been higher, whether the Bourbon dynasty would unite France and Spain under a single crown, creating a Catholic superpower that could dominate Europe and throttle Protestant commerce. Anne, despite her limited military knowledge, grasped these implications with clarity that impressed even skeptical courtiers. John Churchill, now Duke of Marlborough, emerged as the war's directing genius. His partnership with Anne dated back decades, rooted in genuine friendship between the Queen and his wife Sarah, who had served as Anne's closest confidant since childhood. This personal bond translated into political trust that allowed Marlborough unprecedented freedom in conducting military operations. While other coalition commanders struggled with interference from their home governments, Marlborough could plan campaigns confident of royal support. The Battle of Blenheim, fought on August 13, 1704, along the banks of the Danube, demonstrated what English arms could accomplish under inspired leadership. Marlborough's forces, allied with Prince Eugene's Austrians, shattered French and Bavarian armies that had threatened to march on Vienna itself. The victory resonated across Europe like a bell tolling the end of French invincibility. In London, news of the triumph triggered celebrations that lasted for days, with bonfires blazing in every parish and church bells ringing until their bronze voices grew hoarse. The Queen's response to Blenheim revealed her understanding of monarchy's symbolic dimensions. Rather than simply rewarding Marlborough with titles and pensions, she commissioned the construction of Blenheim Palace, a monument to victory that would proclaim English prowess for centuries to come. The massive estate, rising from Oxfordshire meadows like a Baroque dream, embodied Anne's vision of monarchy as national celebration rather than personal aggrandizement. Subsequent victories at Ramillies, Oudenarde and Malplaquet confirmed Marlborough's tactical genius while demonstrating the professional excellence of English forces. These were not the amateur armies that had stumbled through earlier conflicts, but disciplined regiments led by competent officers and supplied by efficient administrative systems. The red-coated infantry who advanced across European battlefields carried with them not just muskets and bayonets, but the reputation of a kingdom that had learned to wage war with scientific precision. Yet military success created political complications that tested Anne's diplomatic skills. The Whig politicians who supported aggressive prosecution of the war grew increasingly demanding about domestic policy, particularly regarding religious toleration and colonial trade. The Tory opposition, while supporting the monarchy, questioned whether continental victories justified the enormous costs in blood and treasure. Anne found herself mediating between factions whose disagreements threatened to undermine the unity that military success required. The Act of Union with Scotland, passed in 1707, represented perhaps Anne's greatest political achievement. The treaty that merged England and Scotland into Great Britain emerged from months of delicate negotiation that required balancing English commercial interests with Scottish pride, Protestant succession concerns with dynastic sensibilities. Anne's personal involvement in the discussions, her willingness to compromise on details while maintaining focus on essential principles, proved crucial to achieving agreement. The Union's terms reflected careful attention to Scottish concerns. The Presbyterian Kirk would remain established north of the border, while Scots' law and educational systems would continue unchanged. Scottish representation in the new British Parliament ensured their voice in imperial decisions, while access to English colonial markets promised economic benefits that might offset the loss of political independence. Most importantly, the Hanoverian succession would apply to both kingdoms, preventing the religious divisions that had threatened to tear Britain apart. Anne's relationship with Sarah Churchill, the imperious Duchess of Marlborough, provided both strength and vulnerability throughout her reign. Their correspondence, preserved in private archives, reveals an intimacy that transcended formal court protocols. Anne signed her letters Mrs. Morley, while addressing the Duchess as Mrs. Freeman, pseudonyms that allowed frank discussion of personalities and policies that shaped their era. Yet this friendship also created opportunities for manipulation that more distant relationships might have avoided. The Duchess's increasingly strident Whig partisanship eventually strained bonds that had seemed unbreakable. As Anne grew more comfortable with royal authority, she resented Sarah's attempts to dictate political appointments and policy directions. The Queen's gradual drift toward Tory ministers like Robert Harley reflected not just changing political calculations but personal assertions of independence from domineering advisors. When the friendship finally ruptured in 1710, both women lost something irreplaceable: Anne, her most trusted confidant; Sarah, her pathway to political influence. The Peace of Utrecht, concluded in 1713, after years of complex negotiations, vindicated Anne's strategic vision while demonstrating her government's diplomatic maturity. The treaty's terms acknowledged British naval supremacy through provisions that opened Spanish colonial markets to English merchants, while preventing Bourbon union under a single crown. Gibraltar and Minorca became British naval bases, securing Mediterranean commerce routes that would prove vital to subsequent imperial expansion. More subtly, Utrecht established principles of balance that would guide European diplomacy for generations. The treaty recognized that lasting peace required acknowledging all major powers' legitimate interests, rather than pursuing total victory that might provoke future conflicts. Anne's ministers, negotiating with patience and skill that impressed even their opponents, had created a settlement that British arms could defend and British commerce could exploit. The succession crisis that overshadowed Anne's final years tested the constitutional arrangements established during the Glorious Revolution. The Act of Settlement, passed in 1701, had designated the Hanoverian dynasty as heirs after Anne's death. But this Protestant succession remained controversial among subjects who valued legitimacy over religious considerations. Jacobite sympathizers, particularly in Scotland and Ireland, continued to regard the exiled James III as their rightful sovereign. Anne's personal feelings about the succession remained diplomatically ambiguous. Her half-brother James, the son whose birth had precipitated her father's downfall, was by blood the closest heir to her throne. Yet she had sworn to uphold the Protestant succession, and her reign's achievements depended on maintaining the constitutional settlement that had made them possible. The Queen's final years were shadowed by this conflict between dynastic sentiment and political necessity. When Anne died in August 1714, she left behind achievements that established her as one of England's most successful sovereigns. The Kingdom of Great Britain that emerged during her reign was stronger, wealthier, and more confident than the realm she had inherited 12 years earlier. The union with Scotland had created a genuinely British identity that transcended ancient ethnic divisions, while military victories had established British influence throughout Europe and the wider world. Perhaps most importantly, Anne had demonstrated that constitutional monarchy could provide effective leadership during times of crisis, while maintaining the parliamentary institutions that protected subjects' liberties. Her reign proved that limited monarchy was not weak monarchy, that sovereigns who ruled by consent, rather than divine right, could achieve lasting greatness. The precedents she established would guide British political development through the challenges of the coming centuries, providing models for democratic societies worldwide. The Stuart dynasty died with Anne, but the constitutional principles that had evolved during her reign would prove more durable than any royal bloodline. In the modest chambers of St. James's Palace, where she had worked through the details of union treaties and succession settlements, Anne had helped create the foundation for parliamentary democracy that would eventually spread across the globe. George II, last king in battle. George Augustus ascended the British throne in June 1727 with advantages his father had never enjoyed: fluent English, familiarity with British customs, and personal relationships with the political leaders who would shape his reign. At 43, the new King George II possessed the courtly graces that had eluded George I. Yet he would discover that being more British than his predecessor brought its own complications. A king who understood parliamentary debates could also be frustrated by them. One who appreciated British culture might also clash with its representatives. The new monarch's relationship with Sir Robert Walpole, inherited from his father's reign, initially appeared stormy. As Prince of Wales, George had cultivated opposition politicians who criticised the First Minister's policies, and his accession seemed likely to bring Walpole's downfall. Yet Queen Caroline, George's intelligent and politically astute wife, understood that changing ministers simply to satisfy personal pique might destabilize the carefully balanced system that kept their dynasty secure. Her private conversations with her husband, conducted in German to ensure confidentiality, gradually convinced him that Walpole's expertise outweighed any personal animosity. Caroline's influence on policy extended far beyond these domestic negotiations. Her intellectual interests, ranging from theology to natural philosophy, made her a patron of scholars and scientists who found the court more welcoming than it had been under George I. She corresponded with Voltaire, debated religious questions with Anglican bishops, and maintained a library that reflected serious engagement with contemporary learning. When courtiers whispered that the Queen governed while the King merely reigned, they acknowledged a political reality that both monarchs found useful. The War of Jenkins' Ear, which erupted in 1739 following years of commercial disputes with Spain, demonstrated both George's military enthusiasm and the constraints that parliamentary government placed on royal ambitions. The conflict's origins, Spanish coastguards allegedly severing a British sea captain's ear during a search for contraband, seemed almost comically trivial, yet they reflected serious tensions over colonial trade that affected thousands of British subjects. George, who had commanded troops at Oudenarde during Marlborough's campaigns, welcomed the prospect of military action that might restore British prestige. Yet the war's conduct revealed how much royal authority had shifted since Queen Anne's reign. Where earlier monarchs had directed military strategy through personal consultation with commanders, George found himself dependent on ministers who controlled parliamentary supply and therefore military operations. Walpole's reluctance to pursue aggressive campaigns clashed with the king's martial instincts, creating tensions that ultimately contributed to the First Minister's resignation in 1742. The War of Austrian Succession, which followed immediately after Jenkins' Ear, provided George with his final opportunity for personal military command. The conflict's European scope, involving France, Austria, Prussia, and most smaller German states, threatened Hanoverian territories that George ruled as elector, as well as British interests throughout the world. At Dettingen in June 1743, the 60-year-old king personally led Allied forces against French armies, becoming the last British monarch to command troops in battle. The Battle of Dettingen itself was more confused than glorious, with Allied victory owing more to French tactical errors than British military genius. Yet George's personal courage under fire, his calm leadership when his horse bolted toward enemy lines, won genuine admiration from soldiers who had questioned whether their German-born king possessed the martial virtues that British tradition demanded. Veterans of the campaign would remember their sovereign's steadiness under cannon fire long after diplomatic details had been forgotten. The Jacobite Rising of 1745 tested both George's political judgment and his military resources in ways that revealed how thoroughly British his dynasty had become. When Charles Edward Stuart landed in Scotland that summer, claiming the throne for his exiled father, he represented not just dynastic competition but cultural and religious alternatives to Hanoverian rule. The young pretender's initial successes, his march to Derby, barely 130 miles from London, created panic that briefly threatened parliamentary government itself. George's response to the Jacobite threat demonstrated political maturity that his father might have envied. Rather than fleeing to Hanover, as some advisers suggested, he remained in London, rallying support for constitutional government while coordinating military operations against the rebels. His public appearances during the crisis, particularly his confident bearing during chapel services at St. James's Palace, reassured subjects who needed to believe their king would defend their Protestant settlement. The Duke of Cumberland's victory at Culloden in April 1746 ended the last serious challenge to Hanoverian succession, but the aftermath revealed troubling aspects of George's character. His approval of Cumberland's harsh pacification of the Scottish Highlands, including the brutal suppression of clan culture and the transportation of suspected Jacobite sympathizers, stained his reign with unnecessary cruelty. The systematic destruction of Highland society that followed Culloden would create grievances that outlasted the dynasty itself. Cultural developments during George's reign reflected the growing sophistication of British society under Hanoverian rule. George Friedrich Handel, the German composer who had followed the dynasty from Hanover, produced his greatest works during these years. The oratorios, Messiah, Israel in Egypt, Judas Maccabeus, that premiered in London's theatres, provided stirring musical celebrations of Protestant triumph and British virtue. When Messiah was first performed in Dublin in 1742, the audience reportedly stood during the Hallelujah chorus, creating a tradition that symbolized the fusion of religious devotion and national pride that characterized Hanoverian culture. The king's personal relationship with Handel illustrated both his musical sophistication and his occasional pettiness. George genuinely appreciated the composer's genius, granting him generous pensions and attending premieres of his works. Yet he also used royal patronage to settle personal scores, withdrawing support when Handel's opera company competed with enterprises favored by the king's mistresses. Such behavior revealed that even constitutional monarchs retained human frailties that could affect policy. Family quarrels that erupted periodically during George's reign exposed the personal costs of royal life while providing endless entertainment for satirical writers. The king's relationship with his eldest son, Frederick, Prince of Wales, deteriorated into public hostility that scandalized foreign observers while delighting British pamphleteers. When Frederick died suddenly in 1751, George reportedly displayed more relief than grief, a reaction that shocked courtiers but reflected genuine animosity that political differences had fostered. The 7 Years' War, which began in 1756, crowned George's reign with military successes that established British global supremacy. Unlike previous conflicts that had been fought primarily in Europe, this war extended to North America, the Caribbean, India, and the Philippines, reflecting the worldwide scope of British commercial interests. The king's enthusiastic support for aggressive prosecution of the war, despite its enormous costs, demonstrated his understanding that British prosperity depended on securing colonial markets and trade routes. William Pitt the Elder, who emerged as the war's directing genius, formed an effective partnership with George that recalled the cooperation between Queen Anne and Marlborough 50 years earlier. Pitt's strategic vision complemented the king's military enthusiasm, while parliamentary support for their policies reflected growing national confidence in British arms. The victories that followed, Plassey, Quebec, Minden, Quiberon Bay, established British dominance on land and sea while eliminating French competition in North America and India. George's death in October 1760, reportedly from a stroke suffered while using his water closet, ended a reign that had consolidated Hanoverian rule while establishing Britain as Europe's dominant power. His 33 years on the throne had seen the constitutional monarchy mature into a system that balanced royal authority with parliamentary responsibility, while maintaining enough personal monarchy to satisfy subjects' bond emotional needs. Perhaps most significantly, George II had demonstrated that constitutional monarchs could provide effective leadership during times of crisis, while respecting the limitations that parliamentary government imposed on royal power. His reign proved that limited monarchy was compatible with military success, cultural achievement, and national greatness. The precedents he established would guide his successors through the even greater challenges that lay ahead, providing models for democratic leadership that would eventually spread throughout the world. George III, Empire, Enlightenment. When George William Frederick ascended the throne in October 760, aged just 22, he brought to the crown an energy and sense of purpose that had been absent from British monarchy for decades. Unlike his predecessors, George III had been born in Britain, spoke English as his native language, and proclaimed in his first speech to Parliament that he gloried in the name of Britain. Yet this apparent advantage, being thoroughly British, would create complications that his more detached Hanoverian ancestors had avoided. The new king's determination to rule as well as reign reflected both personal conviction and political theory absorbed from his tutors. Lord Bute, his Scottish mentor, had instilled in him the idea that previous monarchs had surrendered too much authority to parliamentary factions, that effective government required stronger royal leadership than the Whig oligarchy permitted. George's copy of Blackstone's Commentaries, heavily annotated in his precise handwriting, revealed a young man eager to understand the constitutional limits of his authority while exploring every opportunity to exercise it fully. The 7 Years' War, which George inherited from his grandfather's reign, provided his first major test of leadership. The conflict's global scope had already established British naval supremacy and secured colonial territories from Canada to India, yet its enormous costs threatened national bankruptcy. George's decision to conclude peace negotiations, despite pressure from William Pitt to continue fighting, demonstrated political courage that impressed even his critics. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 secured British gains, while avoiding the financial ruin that prolonged warfare might have caused. Yet the war's aftermath created problems that would dominate George's reign. The vast North American territories acquired from France required administration and defense that strained imperial resources while raising fundamental questions about the relationship between Britain and its colonies. George's ministers, seeking to make colonial subjects contribute to their own governance costs, imposed taxes that seemed reasonable in London but appeared tyrannical in Boston and Philadelphia. The Stamp Act crisis of 1765 revealed both George's political inexperience and his stubborn determination to maintain royal authority. When colonial assemblies refused to accept British taxation without parliamentary representation, the young king initially saw their resistance as simple rebellion that firmness could suppress. His private correspondence reveals a monarch convinced that yielding to colonial demands would encourage further challenges to imperial authority throughout his dominions. The repeal of the Stamp Act in 1766, forced by merchant pressure and parliamentary opposition, taught George painful lessons about the limits of royal will in parliamentary government. Yet he drew from this experience not humility but determination to find ministers who shared his vision of strong royal leadership. The succession of prime ministers who held office during the 1760s and 1770s, Grenville, Rockingham, Chatham, North, reflected his search for advisers who would implement royal policy rather than merely managing parliamentary coalitions. Lord North, who became Prime Minister in 1770, appeared to offer the combination of parliamentary skill and royal loyalty that George sought. Their partnership, lasting 12 years, would oversee both the loss of the American colonies and important domestic reforms that modernized British government. North's genial manner and financial expertise made him personally congenial to George, while his management of parliamentary business provided the stability that effective governance required. The Boston Tea Party in December 1773 crystallized the imperial crisis that had been building since the Stamp Act. George's response, supporting the coercive acts that closed Boston Harbor and revoked Massachusetts' charter, reflected his conviction that imperial authority must be maintained regardless of colonial opinion. The king's private letters reveal a monarch who saw the American dispute in stark terms: either Britain would govern its empire or the empire would dissolve. The outbreak of armed rebellion at Lexington and Concord in April 1775 confronted George with the most serious crisis any British monarch had faced since the Glorious Revolution. Unlike previous royal challenges that had involved dynastic disputes or European wars, this rebellion threatened the entire imperial system that had made Britain prosperous and powerful. George's determination to suppress American independence by military force reflected not just personal stubbornness, but genuine concern for imperial unity. The Declaration of Independence, with its catalogue of grievances against the present King of Great Britain, transformed George from a constitutional monarch into a target of revolutionary propaganda. The document's charges that he had imposed taxes without consent, quartered troops in colonial homes, deprived subjects of trial by jury, ignored the reality that British ministers acting through Parliament had made these decisions. Yet the revolutionaries needed a personal symbol of tyranny, and George's known support for coercive policies made him an ideal target. The American War's conduct revealed both George's strategic limitations and his remarkable personal resilience. His insistence on treating the rebellion as a purely military problem ignored the political dimensions that might have permitted negotiated settlement. Yet his determination to continue fighting despite repeated defeats demonstrated personal courage that kept British resistance alive when lesser men might have yielded. The surrender at Yorktown in October 1781 effectively ended British hopes of suppressing American independence, though George initially refused to accept this reality. His private anguish during these months, recorded in letters to Lord North, reveals a monarch whose entire worldview had been shattered by military defeat. The king who had gloried in the name of Britain now faced the humiliation of acknowledging that Britons could be defeated by their own colonial subjects. The Peace of Paris in 1783, recognizing American independence, represented perhaps the lowest point of George's reign. Yet his acceptance of this diplomatic necessity demonstrated political maturity that his earlier career had not suggested. The king who had once threatened to abdicate rather than yield to colonial demands now swallowed his pride in the interest of preserving what remained of the British Empire. The domestic reforms that followed American defeat revealed George's ability to learn from adversity. His support for William Pitt the Younger, who became Prime Minister in 1783 at the unprecedented age of 24, marked a new phase in his reign. Their partnership would restore British finances, reform imperial administration, and establish the constitutional precedents that would guide the monarchy through the democratic transformations of the next century. The madness that first afflicted George in 1788 created a regency crisis that tested British constitutional arrangements in unprecedented ways. The king's inability to recognize ministers or conduct government business raised questions about royal succession that had no clear legal answers. The Regency Bill, debated while George raved in his apartments at Windsor, would have transferred his authority to the Prince of Wales under parliamentary limitations that redefined royal power. George's unexpected recovery in early 1789, just as the regency arrangements were being finalized, seemed almost miraculous to subjects who had followed his illness through newspaper reports. His return to public duties, marked by a Thanksgiving service at St. Paul's Cathedral, demonstrated the genuine affection that many Britons felt for their afflicted sovereign. The king, who had lost an empire, had somehow gained his people's sympathy. The French Revolution, which erupted just months after George's recovery, provided external validation for his conservative instincts while creating new challenges for British foreign policy. The execution of Louis XVI in 1793 horrified George personally, while convincing him that revolutionary principles threatened all established government. His support for the coalition wars against revolutionary France reflected both dynastic solidarity and genuine fear that British institutions might be swept away by democratic enthusiasm. The Napoleonic Wars that followed tested George's resilience in ways that even the American Rebellion had not. The threat of French invasion, symbolized by the camps that Napoleon assembled at Boulogne, created national emergency that required unprecedented mobilization of British resources. George's public appearances during the invasion scare, particularly his review of volunteer forces in Hyde Park, demonstrated personal courage that inspired national resistance. Trafalgar in 1805 and Waterloo 10 years later vindicated George's determination to resist French hegemony while establishing British naval supremacy that would last a century. Yet the war's costs had strained national finances and created social tensions that would dominate British politics for decades. The king, who had witnessed imperial defeat, had lived to see even greater imperial triumph, though at costs that his successors would struggle to manage. The final decade of George's reign was shadowed by the mental illness that increasingly isolated him from public affairs. The formal establishment of the Prince Regent's authority in 1811 marked the effective end of his personal rule, though he lingered until 1820, blind and mad, but somehow symbolic of national endurance. His death, when it finally came, marked the end of an era that had seen Britain transformed from a European power into a global empire. George III's 60-year reign had encompassed the loss of America, the defeat of Napoleon, the beginnings of industrial revolution, and the emergence of democratic politics that would reshape the modern world. His personal failings, the stubbornness that lost America, the periodic madness that incapacitated him, were balanced by virtues that served his kingdom well in times of crisis. He had demonstrated that constitutional monarchy could provide effective leadership while adapting to changing circumstances, that ancient institutions could survive revolutionary challenges while maintaining their essential character. George IV, Regency Splendor. The Prince Regent, who had governed Britain during his father's final illness, ascended the throne in January 1820 as George IV, bringing with him a reputation for magnificent excess that both delighted and scandalized his subjects. At 57, the new king possessed artistic sensibilities and cultural sophistication that far exceeded those of his predecessors. Yet his personal conduct had created scandals that threatened the monarchy's moral authority. His reign would demonstrate both the creative possibilities and the dangerous limitations of royal self-indulgence. George's transformation of the royal pavilion at Brighton represented his aesthetic vision at its most extravagant. The exotic Indo-Islamic architecture that rose from the Sussex seaside, like a Maharaja's fever dream, reflected his fascination with Oriental culture, while providing a playground for pleasures that conventional society condemned. The pavilion's interiors, with their dragons and palm trees, lotus blossoms and serpents, created an atmosphere of theatrical fantasy that perfectly suited a monarch who approached kingship as performance art. The king's patronage of architecture extended beyond personal pleasure to national monument. His collaboration with John Nash in redesigning central London created the streetscapes that still define the capital's ceremonial heart. Regent Street, sweeping in a gentle curve from Oxford Circus to Piccadilly Circus, provided a grand thoroughfare worthy of imperial capital while demonstrating how royal taste could shape urban development. The terraces of Regent's Park, with their cream-coloured stucco facades and classical proportions, offered middle-class families the opportunity to live in settings that suggested aristocratic grandeur. Yet George's extravagance created financial crises that embarrassed his ministers and alarmed Parliament. His debts, accumulating since his youth, had reached astronomical proportions that required repeated parliamentary bailouts. The civil list that supposedly covered royal expenses proved woefully inadequate for a monarch whose idea of economy involved reducing his household from 300 servants to a mere 200. His subjects, struggling with post-war economic depression, found it difficult to sympathize with a sovereign whose annual expenditure exceeded the lifetime earnings of thousands of families. The Queen Caroline affair, which dominated the early years of George's reign, revealed both his personal vindictiveness and the political constraints that limited royal authority. His attempt to divorce Caroline of Brunswick, whom he had married reluctantly in 1795, required parliamentary action that exposed intimate details of royal marriage to public scrutiny. The Bill of Pains and Penalties introduced to strip Caroline of royal title created a sensational trial that turned the estranged queen into a popular heroine while making George appear petty and vindictive. Caroline's return to England in 1820, despite government attempts to buy her continued exile, triggered demonstrations that threatened public order while embarrassing the new king. The crowds that cheered her progress through London streets were protesting not just George's marital conduct, but the entire system of privilege and corruption that his reign seemed to represent. When she appeared at Westminster Abbey for George's coronation, only to be turned away by guards acting on royal orders, the symbolism was unmistakable. The king who claimed to represent his people was literally excluding one of them from national celebration. The coronation itself, held in July 1821, demonstrated George's genius for ceremonial display while revealing his disconnection from contemporary political realities. The elaborate costume he designed for himself, purple velvet trimmed with ermine, a train several yards long, jeweled orders and decorations, created a spectacle that impressed foreign visitors while amusing British subjects. The ceremony's cost, estimated at over £200, provoked criticism that intensified when contrasted with the economic hardships that working families faced. Yet George's cultural legacy extended far beyond personal extravagance to genuine artistic patronage that enriched British civilization. His collection of paintings, assembled with real connoisseurs' knowledge, included masterpieces by Dutch and Flemish masters that now form the core of national collections. His support for contemporary artists like Thomas Lawrence, whose portraits captured the elegance and confidence of Regency society, established artistic standards that influenced British taste for generations. The king's literary interests, though less well known than his architectural projects, reflected sophisticated appreciation for contemporary writing. His friendship with Walter Scott, whom he created a baronet during his visit to Scotland in 1822, demonstrated genuine respect for literary achievement while providing royal patronage that helped establish Scott's international reputation. The elaborate ceremonies that George staged during his Scottish visit, complete with Highland dress and Celtic pageantry, might have seemed theatrical to skeptics, but they represented serious attempts to integrate Scottish identity into British nationalism. Catholic emancipation, the great political question that dominated the later years of George's reign, revealed the tension between his personal prejudices and constitutional necessity. The king's opposition to granting political rights to Catholic subjects reflected both religious conviction and dynastic memory. His grandfather had lost the American colonies partly through disputes over religious toleration, while his father had suffered periodic madness that some attributed to conflicts over Catholic relief. Yet the pressure of events in Ireland, where Daniel O'Connell's Catholic Association threatened civil disobedience, made some form of concession inevitable. The Duke of Wellington's conversion to Catholic emancipation, following his appointment as Prime Minister in 1828, created a governmental crisis that tested George's understanding of constitutional monarchy. Wellington, the victor of Waterloo, possessed military prestige that made his political judgment difficult to question, yet his support for Catholic relief directly contradicted royal policy. The king's initial resistance, including threats of abdication that recalled his father's behavior during similar crises, ultimately gave way to acceptance that demonstrated political maturity. The Catholic Relief Act of 1829, passed despite royal reservations, marked a crucial development in British constitutional history. George's reluctant assent to legislation he personally opposed established the principle that monarchs must ultimately yield to ministerial advice backed by parliamentary majorities. The precedent would prove crucial during the democratic reforms of subsequent decades, providing constitutional cover for changes that traditional monarchs might have found intolerable. George's final years were shadowed by increasing ill health and growing isolation from public affairs. The laudanum addiction that had begun as medical treatment for various ailments gradually undermined his capacity for sustained attention to governmental business. His appearance at public functions became increasingly rare, while his once impressive physical presence deteriorated into bloated caricature that satirical artists delighted in depicting. The king's death in June 1830 at Windsor Castle ended a reign that had encompassed both cultural achievement and personal scandal on unprecedented scales. His funeral, conducted with the elaborate ceremony he would have appreciated, provided final demonstration of royal magnificence while marking the end of an era when monarchs could indulge personal tastes without regard for public opinion. George IV's legacy remained complex and contradictory. His architectural patronage had created some of London's most beautiful buildings, while his personal conduct had damaged the monarchy's moral authority. His sophisticated cultural tastes had elevated British artistic standards, while his financial irresponsibility had created constitutional crises. Most significantly, his reign had demonstrated that constitutional monarchy must evolve to meet changing public expectations or risk losing popular support. The reform movements that gathered strength during George's final years, demands for parliamentary reform, religious equality, and broader political participation, reflected social changes that royal splendor could no longer disguise. His successor would inherit a kingdom where democratic ideas had taken root among middle-class families, whose political consciousness had been awakened by the very prosperity that Georgian Britain had created. The age of reform was dawning, and monarchy would need to adapt or risk irrelevance.